Good evening, dear listener. You're safe here at Olympus Dreams. Tonight we journey to a place where fire meets artistry, where rejection becomes creation, and where a god cast aside finds his truest power. If you'd like more gentle journeys, a soft like or subscribe keeps the lantern lit here. Settle into comfort now. Let your breathing slow. The forge awaits, glowing soft as sunset, and the story unfolds like heated bronze flowing into its mold. Above the world, where clouds taste of nectar and the air shimmers with impossible light, Mount Olympus rises. Its peaks pierce the ceiling of mortal sight, marble halls gleaming eternal in sunshine that never quite fades. Here, the gods dwell in beauty so complete it makes the heart ache. Every surface reflects perfection. Every angle pleases the eye. Even the stones beneath divine feet seem polished by the breath of heaven itself. In these halls of endless glory, Hera walked alone. Queen of the gods, wife of Zeus, her presence commanded stillness. Her robes flowed like water made silk. Her crown caught light and held it. She was beauty with purpose, grace with authority. And on this particular morning, she felt the familiar stirring of new life within her. Another child. Another immortal soul preparing to join the radiance of Olympus. The birth came, as births do, even among gods. There was pain, brief but absolute, then the sudden absence of it. The midwife goddesses attended with gentle hands and softer voices. They lifted the infant, cleaned him, wrapped him in cloth spun from moonlight, and then, in the quiet that follows all arrivals, they hesitated. Hera reached for her son. She took him in her arms, this small creature still damp from birth, his eyes squeezed shut against the brightness of the world. She looked down at his face, and her expression, so carefully composed, shifted. His leg, the left one, it turned at an angle that nature had not intended. The bone curved where it should run straight. The foot rested awkwardly, already suggesting the uneven gait that would mark his steps forever. In a place where perfection was not merely valued but expected, where every god embodied ideal form, this child bore visible difference. Hera's breath caught. Not with love or wonder, but with something colder. Assessment. Calculation. The kind of thinking that measures worth against appearance, that weighs beauty on scales never meant for souls. She stood. The midwives stepped back. They knew that look. They had served Olympus long enough to recognize rejection before it found words. Hera held the infant away from her body now, at arm's length, as if distance might change what she saw. The child made small sounds, the universal language of newborns seeking warmth. She did not draw him closer. Through the marble corridors she walked, her steps purposeful, her face a mask of cool determination. Other gods glimpsed her passing and looked away. They understood. Olympus demanded certain standards. Not every divine birth resulted in suitable offspring. Sometimes nature erred, even in heaven. Sometimes correction was required. She reached the edge. The great balcony where Olympus meets the sky, where solid stone gives way to endless air. Below, impossibly far below, the mortal world spread like a tapestry woven from distance and mist. Clouds drifted past, thick as wool, soft as forgetfulness. The drop was infinite. No mortal had ever fallen from this height and lived. But this was no mortal. Hera looked at the child once more. His eyes had opened, dark and somehow already knowing. For a moment, the briefest fragment of time, she felt something flutter in her chest. Doubt, perhaps, or recognition of what this would mean. But Olympus stood behind her, beautiful and perfect and unforgiving. And she was its queen. She let go. The infant fell. Small body tumbling through emptiness, cloth wrappings fluttering like wounded bird wings. He did not cry out. He simply fell, down through the layers of cloud, through the boundary between divine realm and earthly sky, spinning slowly in the grip of gravity that cared nothing for godhood or birthright. The clouds embraced him as he passed. Soft and damp, they slowed his descent just slightly, wrapping around him like reluctant hands. Mist beaded on his skin, collected in his dark hair. The world rushed upward to meet him. Sky became distance, became horizon, became the waiting surface of the sea. He struck the water. Not with violence, but with a splash that barely disturbed the rolling waves. The ocean received him as it receives all things, neither cruel nor kind, simply present and vast. The water closed over his head, foam and salt and the endless deep. But the sea is older than Olympus. The ocean remembers things the mountains have forgotten. And in its depths, beings dwelt who understood mercy in ways the sky gods had unlearned. Thetis felt the disturbance in her waters. The silver-footed nymph, daughter of the ancient sea, turned from her play among the coral groves. Something had fallen. Something small and divine and desperately in need of air. She rose through the blue-green darkness like light ascending. Her hands, gentle as tide pools, found the infant tumbling in the current. She lifted him toward the surface, toward breath, toward life that had been meant to end. His eyes opened underwater, meeting hers. And in that moment, beneath the waves where Olympus could not see, Hephaestus found his first true mother. Eurynome joined her, daughter of Oceanus, her wisdom deep as ocean trenches. Together they cradled the child, their luminous forms creating a cocoon of safety in the dangerous blue. They rose with him, breaking the surface where sunlight danced on wavelets and the air tasted of salt and second chances. The infant coughed. Water streamed from his nose and mouth. And then, impossibly, he breathed. His chest rose and fell, drawing in the air his mother had denied him. He did not cry. He simply breathed, again and again, each breath an act of defiance against the judgment of heaven. Thetis held him close, her silver hair falling around them both like a curtain drawn against cruel skies. Eurynome touched his twisted leg with fingers that had shaped coastlines. They looked at each other, these ancient daughters of water, and they understood. This child would not be returned. This child was theirs now. The sea had claimed what heaven discarded. They descended together, carrying their precious burden down through shafts of filtered light, past schools of fish that scattered like silver coins, down to where the ocean floor rose in formations of impossible beauty. Here, in the deep where pressure should crush mortal bones, they brought him to a cave. Not dark and foreboding, but luminous with its own strange magic. The walls were silver, shot through with veins of pearl that glowed with bioluminescent grace. Coral formations grew in colors that had no names, shapes that suggested dreams rather than geology. Through cracks in the stone ceiling, light filtered down in wavering columns, painting everything in shades of blue and green and the peculiar purple of deep water beauty. The current moved gently here, rhythmic as breathing, the pulse of the ocean made visible. They laid him on a bed of softest kelp, woven thick and warm. The cave held them in its curved embrace, safe from the hunting things that prowled the darker deeps. Thetis smoothed his damp hair. Eurynome wrapped him in cloth that never stayed wet, that held warmth even here beneath the waves. And Hephaestus, whose name he did not yet know, whose identity remained unformed as clay before the potter's touch, slept at last. His breathing settled into the rhythm of the tides. His small hand curled around Thetis's finger, holding on with surprising strength. Above, on distant Olympus, Hera returned to her halls. She did not speak of what she had done. No one asked. The other gods understood that some things remained unmentioned, some decisions uncommented upon. Life continued in its perfect beauty, unmarred by the memory of imperfect birth. The sun still shone, the nectar still flowed. The music still played through corridors of eternal light. But below, in a silver grotto where the ocean held its breath, something new began. A different kind of story. The tale of a god who would find his worth not despite his wound, but within it. Who would transform rejection into creation, abandonment into art, and pain into purpose. His hammer had not yet fallen. His forge remained unlit. But in the gentle rocking of the underwater cave, in the warmth of unexpected love, the foundation was laid. The smith was beginning, though he did not yet know what he would build. The ocean kept its secrets well. Days passed in the silver grotto, measured not by sun or moon, but by the slow pulse of tides against stone, the gentle shift of currents that carried food and warmth through the underwater chambers. Hephaestus grew in this strange sanctuary, this place between worlds where light fell blue and sounds arrived muffled, softened by the weight of water overhead. Thetis sang to him in the language of waves. Her voice held no words, only the rise and fall of ancient rhythms, melodies that predated speech itself. She fed him nectar gathered from deep-sea flowers that bloomed in volcanic vents, their petals translucent as jellyfish, their sweetness unlike anything that grew in air. He grew strong on this food, his small body filling out, his lungs learning to draw breath in the peculiar atmosphere of the grotto where water and air mingled in ways that should not be possible. Eurynome taught him gentler lessons. She showed him how coral built itself, how stone could grow like living things when given time and patience. She placed shells in his hands, letting him feel their spirals, the mathematics of nature made tangible. She brought him fragments of shipwrecks, smooth wood worn by salt and time, bronze nails green with verdigris, iron bent and softened by the sea's long patience. He learned to crawl on the silver floor, his twisted leg dragging slightly but not painfully. The water helped him, buoyant and forgiving. Here, his difference mattered less. Here, movement came easier than it would ever come on land. He pulled himself between the coral formations, his small hands grasping at stone and shell, his eyes wide with curiosity that had no shame attached to it. The grotto held other visitors. Small fish darted through the chambers, their scales catching light like scattered coins. An octopus made its home in a nearby crevice, its 8 arms flowing like liquid thought. Sometimes dolphins came, their songs echoing through the water, their play gentle when the child was near. Thetis spoke to them in clicks and whistles, and they answered, their intelligence obvious in eyes that held no judgment. Years folded into years. The child grew into a boy, though time moved differently here, stretched and strange. He learned to swim, his strong arms compensating for the leg that would never straighten, his body finding its own grace in the forgiving water. He explored the reaches of his underwater home, discovering chambers within chambers, grottos within grottos, each one holding its own wonders. In one room, crystals grew from floor to ceiling, their surfaces faceted and gleaming. In another, bioluminescent creatures clustered like stars, their cold light painting constellations on wet stone. He found pools where water stayed perfectly still, mirror smooth, reflecting the filtered light in ways that made him pause and stare. He found crevices where volcanic heat leaked through, warming the water to blood temperature, creating pockets of comfort in the cool deep. But it was the shells that captured his attention most completely. The fragments of the world above, delivered by current and chance to his silver sanctuary. He collected them, arranging them by size, by color, by the sound they made when tapped against stone. He noticed how some curved inward, how others flared outward, how each one held a pattern unique as snowflakes, though he had never seen snow. Thetis watched him sort his treasures. She saw how his small hands moved with increasing precision, how his eyes studied shapes with an intensity that seemed beyond his years. She brought him more fragments. Pieces of pottery, smooth and painted, bits of jewelry, bronze and copper and sometimes gold, dropped from ships or offered by sailors to hungry gods. He touched them all, turned them over, held them to the light. One day she brought him wire. Thin bronze, corroded green, but still workable. He took it in his hands, felt its flexibility, discovered that it could be bent and shaped. For hours he worked, tongue between his teeth, fingers patient and persistent. When he finished, he had made a circle. Simple, imperfect, but deliberate. His first creation. A ring of green bronze that caught the wavering light and held it. He offered it to Thetis with shy pride. She took it, turned it in her silver fingers, and smiled. She wore it on her hand where it looked like nothing much, a child's clumsy attempt. But she wore it nonetheless, and he understood that this mattered, that making things and giving them meaning was perhaps the most important work in any world. Eurynome saw it too. She brought him more materials, driftwood and coral fragments, smooth stones and pieces of amber washed down from northern shores. She showed him how pressure could shape things, how time was sometimes the greatest tool of all. She taught him patience without speaking it aloud, simply by being patient herself, by never rushing, by letting the ocean's rhythms dictate their days. He made other things. Crude at first, childish and crooked, necklaces of strung shells that fell apart when lifted, figures of coral that looked like nothing in particular. But his hands grew surer. His eye grew sharper. He learned to see not just what things were, but what they could become. The grotto had one more secret. Deeper down, past chambers he had explored, through passages narrow and twisting, there existed a place where the ocean floor split open. Here, the Earth's blood rose in black plumes, superheated water thick with minerals. The volcanic vent breathed fire into water, creating clouds of heat and chemical richness where strange life flourished. Hephaestus found it by accident, following a current that felt warmer than the rest. He emerged into a chamber lit not by filtered sunlight, but by the red glow of magma visible through cracks in stone. The heat hit him like a wall, fierce and elemental. Steam rose in columns where water met fire. The walls sweated minerals, depositing layers of black and gold and deep red. He should have fled. The heat was dangerous even for divine blood. But he stood at the threshold of that burning chamber and felt something wake inside him. Recognition without memory, a hunger without name. He reached toward the heat, felt it kiss his palm without burning, felt its power call to something buried deep in his divine nature. Thetis found him there, transfixed. She pulled him back gently, led him to cooler water, but she saw the look in his eyes. She understood. The child of heaven had found his element, and it was fire. Here, beneath the waves, in the last place one would expect it, the first forge was waiting. The hammer would soon be lifted. The smith's true work was about to begin, patient as coral, hot as the earth's heart, inevitable as the tide. The volcanic chamber became his secret cathedral, a place he visited when Thetis and Eurynome thought him occupied with shells or coral. He could not explain the pull, the way his blood sang in harmony with the superheated water, the way his lungs drew the sulphurous steam without coughing. The heat should have repelled him. Instead, it welcomed him like a mother's arms never had. He began bringing his collected fragments to this deeper place. The bronze wire he'd shaped into rings, pieces of copper turned green by salt and time. Small lumps of tin discovered in the silt. He laid them on the black stone near the vent's mouth, where water barely covered them, where heat concentrated most fiercely. He watched what happened, how the metals softened, how they began to weep and run, how they transformed from solid to liquid, from fixed to possibility. The first time he touched molten bronze with his bare fingers, Thetis gasped from the passage behind him. She had followed, worried by his absence. She expected to find him burned, screaming, divine flesh bubbling and ruined. Instead, he turned to her with wonder in his face, holding a droplet of liquid metal in his palm like captured sunlight. It did not burn him. It pooled and cooled, hardening into a tear-shaped pendant that gleamed even in the red dimness. She understood then what she had been caring for, not merely a rejected child, not simply a cast-off of Olympus, but a god of forge and fire, born with flame running beneath his skin instead of blood. The heat that would kill others nourished him. The element that destroyed was his to command. After that, she helped. She showed him where to find better metals, which stones contained copper, which held tin. She taught him how to recognize iron's dark ore, though true smithing of that difficult metal lay years ahead. Eurynome brought him tools salvaged from shipwrecks, a stone hammer, crude but functional, flat rocks that could serve as anvils, fragments of mold and chisel lost by human craftsmen who never imagined their tools would descend to such depths. He learned by doing, by failure and patience. The underwater forge presented challenges no surface smithy would face. Water quenched metal too quickly, making it brittle. Steam obscured his work. Currents cooled his pieces before they could properly set. But he adapted. He built small dams of stone to create air pockets. He learned to work faster, to strike while metal held its heat. He discovered that some alloys welcomed water's touch, emerging harder and more beautiful for the rapid cooling. His creations evolved from simple to complex. Rings became bracelets. Bracelets became necklaces with worked clasps. He made combs for Eurynome's hair, each tooth perfectly spaced. He crafted a mirror for Thetis, polishing bronze until it reflected her face with startling clarity. He shaped fish from copper, so lifelike they seemed ready to swim. He made stars from silver, tiny and perfect, which Eurynome scattered across the grotto ceiling where they caught light like their celestial cousins. The hammering became his heartbeat. The rhythm of metal on metal, stone on bronze, the endless patient striking that shaped formless material into deliberate beauty. Each blow was meditation. Each piece was prayer, not to gods, for what did he know of them except rejection, but to the work itself, to the transformation, to the miracle of taking raw earth and making it sing. Time passed in the way it does beneath waves, measured not by sun or season, but by the rhythm of tides and the accumulation of small perfections. Hephaestus grew. His shoulders broadened. His arms thickened with muscle earned through endless striking. His hands, once small and uncertain, became sure and strong, capable of holding heat, shaping stubborn metal, finding beauty in resistant materials. His leg remained twisted. The water's buoyancy masked it while he swam, but when he rested on stone, it bent at angles that made Thetis wince. Yet he moved through his forge with surprising grace. He had learned his body's limits and worked within them. Where he could not walk smoothly, he braced. Where he could not stand long, he sat. The work mattered more than the working, the creation more than the creator's form. The sea nymphs began to notice. Sisters of Thetis, daughters of Oceanus, curious spirits who swam the deeps and sometimes surfaced to dance on moonlit waves. They came seeking the source of beautiful things appearing among their kind. A pendant here, a bracelet there, pieces of such delicate craftsmanship, they seemed almost to have grown rather than been made. They found a young god in a chamber of fire and water, covered in soot that the sea kept washing away, hammering tirelessly at something that glowed orange in the dimness. They watched from doorways and crevices. They whispered among themselves. They asked Thetis who he was, where he had come from, why she had hidden him so long. She told them only that he was hers to protect, and that his past belonged to silence. But she could not stop them from spreading word of the underwater smith, the maker of impossible things, the god who worked where fire met ocean and made both elements serve his vision. His reputation grew like coral, slowly but with undeniable presence. Nymphs commissioned pieces. A comb for Galatea, earrings for Amphitrite, a crown of worked gold for Thetis herself, who wore it only in private, afraid that such beauty might draw unwanted attention from above. Each request he fulfilled with care, pouring into the work a love he could express no other way. He made gifts without commission, too. For the dolphins who visited his grotto, he shaped bells that chimed with their movements, turning their play into music. For the octopus that cleaned his workspace, he crafted a shell palace, chambers within chambers, perfectly fitted. For the small fish that darted through the passages, he made nothing, for they needed nothing, but he watched them and learned from their effortless grace. The forge became more than workspace. It became temple, home, purpose, made manifest in stone and fire. He added to it constantly, building better air pockets, refining his anvils, creating storage for metals and tools. He carved channels in the floor so molten metal could flow safely. He positioned stones to reflect heat precisely where needed. The crude chamber transformed into something approaching sophistication, a place where craft could flourish. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between strikings, when metal cooled and new work had not yet begun, he wondered about the world above, about the place from which he'd fallen, the gods who dwelt there, the mother whose face he could not quite remember. But these thoughts came rarely and departed quickly, driven away by the next project, the next challenge, the next opportunity to transform shapeless potential into completed beauty. He was content. Perhaps more than content. The silver grotto had given him safety. Thetis and Eurynome had given him love, but the forge had given him something deeper. Purpose, identity. A reason to wake each morning and lift the hammer once more. In the depths where light barely reached, where pressure should have crushed and cold should have numbed, a young god had found his calling. The fire that burned in his blood had found its expression, and the work, patient as stone, hot as earth's heart, inevitable as tide, continued. The pieces began to travel, not through intention, but through the nature of beautiful things, which refused to remain hidden. A nymph wearing one of his bracelets surfaced near a fishing vessel and was glimpsed by mortal eyes. The story spread, distorted by retelling, about jewelry that seemed alive with captured light. A dolphin wearing his bells swam too close to shore, and children heard the chiming sweet and strange, unlike any sound their world produced. And sometimes, rarely, a piece found its way to places he had never intended. A current might carry a dropped earring through underwater passages that led eventually to shallower waters. A curious seal might take a shining thing in its mouth and swim toward sunlit coasts. The ocean kept few secrets long. What the depths held, the surface eventually discovered. On Olympus, where marble gleamed eternal and ambrosia flowed like wine, Hera received a gift. It arrived without ceremony, brought by a minor goddess whose name was less important than her offering. A brooch, small enough to rest in the palm, yet heavy with presence. Gold worked so finely it seemed almost liquid, set with gems that held light the way water holds memory. Hera lifted it slowly, turning it in fingers that had held scepters and lightning. The craftsmanship was unlike anything in Olympus's considerable treasuries. No rough hammer marks, no visible seams. The piece seemed to have emerged complete from its maker's mind, as though thought alone had given it form. The gems were set so perfectly they appeared to float within the gold, suspended in impossible security. She fastened it to her robe. The brooch caught sunlight, fractured it, threw it back in colors that had no names. The other goddesses noticed immediately. "Where did you get that?" they asked. "Who made it? How can we commission similar work?" Hera deflected their questions with practiced grace, but privately she wondered the same things. She made inquiries, subtle ones, befitting a queen who did not chase rumors directly. She sent messages to minor deities who moved between realms, asking about craftsmen, about smiths, about anyone creating work of this caliber. The answers came back slowly, carried on whispers and half-truths. Someone beneath the waves. A forge where fire should not burn. A maker whose name the sea nymphs would not speak. Something stirred in Hera's perfect memory. Something uncomfortable, like a stone in an otherwise flawless garden. She pushed it away. The past was vast, and she was queen of heaven. Surely there were many craftsmen in the world, many forges, many makers of beautiful things. This one was simply more talented than most, but the brooch remained pinned to her favorite robe. And sometimes, when light struck it at certain angles, she felt a sensation she could not name. Not quite guilt. Not quite recognition. Something older and more complicated, like an answer to a question she had buried long ago. Beneath the waves, Hephaestus knew nothing of Olympus's curiosity. His world remained bounded by stone walls and thermal currents, by the rhythm of work and the satisfaction of completion. He had begun a new project, something more ambitious than jewelry or decorative pieces, something that required weeks of planning, of sketching in soot on flat rocks, of gathering specific materials. A throne, not for sitting exactly, or rather, for sitting once and remaining seated thereafter. The idea had come to him in the manner of all good ideas, arriving complete and undeniable, as though it had always existed and merely waited for him to notice. He worked the design carefully, building the frame from metals he had alloyed himself, mixing gold and silver and something darker, something he had pulled from the deepest parts of his forge where heat approached divine. The throne's beauty was undeniable. The back rose in gentle curves that suggested wings. The arms swept forward like welcoming gestures. Their surfaces worked with patterns that seemed to shift as light played across them. The seat itself was cushioned with materials he had woven from precious metals, so fine they felt like fabric, soft enough for comfort, strong enough to last millennia. But within the throne's elegant structure, he built other things, mechanisms so subtle they were invisible, hidden in the scrollwork and decorative elements. Springs that would release at precise pressure, locks disguised as ornamental joinings. A cage made beautiful, a trap made welcoming. He worked with absolute focus, each piece fitting to the next with tolerances measured in whispers. Thetis watched him work and said nothing. She had learned long ago that some projects demanded silence, that certain creations required their makers to journey inward where questions could not follow. She brought him food he barely tasted. She ensured the forge remained supplied. And she wondered, in the private spaces of her concern, what this throne was for and what it meant. When he finished, Hephaestus sat back and studied his work. The throne gleamed in the red dimness, every surface perfect, every joint invisible. It was perhaps the finest thing he had ever made. Beautiful enough to tempt gods, strong enough to hold them, clever enough to keep them, at least for a time. He ran his hand along one arm, feeling the mechanisms hidden beneath beauty. They responded to his touch with faint clicks, recognizing their creator, refusing to engage. He stood, his twisted leg briefly visible before the water's movement concealed it again, and circled the throne slowly. "For the Queen of Heaven," he said aloud, his voice strange in the chamber where he so rarely spoke. The words carried no particular emotion. Not anger, not love. Simply statement, simple as naming. He arranged for its delivery through channels he had established, nymphs who moved between depths and shallows, who could breach the surface and walk briefly on land before returning to their proper element. He gave them careful instructions, where to bring it, how to present it, what to say when asked who sent it. A gift from the depths, they would answer, from one who remembers. The throne left his grotto carried by currents and willing hands, traveling through passages he himself had never swum, moving toward a destination he had left as an infant and never seen since. Hephaestus returned to his forge. There was other work waiting. There was always other work, but for once the hammering stopped. He stood in the red dimness, surrounded by tools and materials, by the evidence of his skill and the proof of his purpose. And he waited, though he could not have said for what. Perhaps for word of the throne's arrival, perhaps for consequences he knew would come, perhaps simply for the next breath, the next moment, the next inevitable step in a story whose ending he could not yet see. Above, far above, beyond water and stone and the weight of ocean, a throne climbed toward Olympus. And on Olympus, a queen who did not yet know her past was arriving wore a brooch that caught light like questions. The distance between them remained vast, but distance, as any craftsman knows, is just another material. And materials, given time and heat and patient work, can always be transformed. The throne arrived at Olympus on the 8th day, carried through the final ascent by nymphs whose skin still glistened with seawater, whose hair dripped onto marble that had never known rain. They moved through the great halls with the careful reverence of those who understood. They walked where they did not belong, past columns that held up sky itself, beneath ceilings painted with the history of divine dominion. The Olympians gathered as word spread through the palace. A gift had come. Something magnificent, something meant for their queen. The nymphs set it down in the central hall, that vast space where Zeus held court and where light fell through windows that opened onto nothing but air and distance. Then they departed quickly, barefoot and silent, leaving wet prints that evaporated before anyone thought to follow them. Hera approached slowly. Other goddesses stepped back, granting her space, though their eyes remained fixed on the throne's gleaming surfaces. Even in a palace filled with divine treasures, where every object had been touched by immortal hands and shaped by impossible craft, this piece stood apart. The gold caught light from sources that shouldn't have reached it. The silver seemed to hold its own illumination, soft as moonlight filtered through water. The dark metal woven through both created shadows that suggested depth, as though one could reach into the throne and touch something beyond its physical form. Who sent this? Hera's voice carried the particular tone she used when pleasure mixed with suspicion, when beauty arrived from unknown sources. The minor goddess who had received the delivery stepped forward, her hands folded, her eyes downcast in the manner of those who bear messages they don't fully understand. The nymph spoke of depths, my queen, of one who remembers. They offered no name. Hera circled the throne. Her fingers traced patterns in the metalwork, feeling craftsmanship that exceeded anything in her own chambers, anything Zeus had commissioned, anything she had seen in all her immortal years. The cushioning gave slightly beneath her touch, responsive as living tissue, warm as though the throne itself breathed. One who remembers, she repeated softly. The words meant nothing. Or perhaps they meant something she chose not to examine, not hear, not before assembled eyes. Zeus had entered during her inspection, drawn by curiosity, or perhaps by the sense that important moments were unfolding without his participation. He studied the throne with the appreciation of one who understood value, who recognized when an object transcended mere function. Remarkable work, he said. The mechanisms alone. He leaned closer, squinting at joints that shouldn't be possible, at seams that didn't exist. I'd never seen anything quite. It's meant for me, Hera interrupted. Not a question, a claim. The message had specified the Queen of Heaven. Only one goddess held that title, regardless of Zeus's various romances and their divine offspring. She settled onto the throne with the grace she brought to all movements, her robes arranging themselves perfectly, her posture embodying divine authority. The cushioning accepted her weight with absolute comfort. The arms curved around her in what felt like embrace. For a moment, nothing happened. She sat, radiant and regal, framed by metal that made her seem even more magnificent than usual. Several goddesses murmured appreciation. Even Zeus nodded approval. Then, so subtly that only Hera felt it initially, the throne's arms tightened. Not painfully. There was no violence in the movement. The metal simply shifted, mechanisms engaging with clicks too soft for others to hear, springs releasing in sequence, locks sliding into place with the precision of calculations made over weeks of careful planning. The arms drew closer, not crushing, not even uncomfortable, but utterly immovable. Hera's expression barely changed. She was too practiced, too aware of watching eyes. But her hands moved to the arms, pressing, testing. Nothing yielded. She tried to rise, engaging muscles that had once held back titans, that could still shake mountains when anger moved through them. The throne held her as gently as it had welcomed her, as completely as ocean holds its depths. "My lord," she said quietly, still maintaining perfect composure, though something sharp had entered her voice. "I appear to be secured." Zeus stepped forward, his amusement fading into concern. He gripped one of the throne's arms and pulled. Strength that moved planets, that could reshape reality itself, met resistance that refused to acknowledge his power. The metal didn't even warm beneath his hands. Other gods tried. Ares, who knew force in all its forms. Apollo, who understood balance and leverage. Even Athena, whose wisdom extended to mechanisms and their secrets. Each attempt failed with the same absolute finality. The throne had been designed to hold, and hold it would, until its creator decided otherwise. Hera sat through it all with rigid dignity, though her composure grew more brittle with each failed attempt. She had been trapped before, constrained by circumstance or rival deities. But this was different. This was personal. This was deliberate. This was a message encoded in metal, delivered from someone who had measured her precisely and found her wanting only the ability to leave. Who made this? Zeus's voice carried the particular thunder that preceded storms, wars, the dissolution of peace. Investigations began immediately. The nymphs were questioned, though they knew little beyond their instructions. Hermes descended to various realms, seeking gossip, purchasing information with promises and coin. Word filtered back slowly, pieces assembling like a puzzle no one wanted to complete. A craftsman beneath the waves. A forge fed by volcanic heat. Work of unprecedented quality appearing over years, jewelry and ornaments that had circulated among sea dwellers before occasional pieces surfaced. And finally, reluctantly, Thetis was summoned. She arrived cloaked in water that evaporated as she walked, leaving her draped in silks that moved like currents. She stood before Zeus with the particular courage of those who had once been offered to him and refused, who had chosen her own path and lived to defend that choice. "The craftsman," Zeus said. "Name him." Thetis met his eyes without flinching. Hephaestus. The name meant nothing to most assembled gods. It was too old, too buried, associated with no great deeds or famous interventions. But Hera went still, her hands tightening on arms that wouldn't release, her face losing carefully maintained neutrality. "Impossible," she whispered. "He was." "Saved," Thetis finished. "Raised. Taught. He lives still, and his gifts are considerable." Zeus turned to Hera, questions forming. But she looked away, unable or unwilling to meet his gaze, trapped in a throne that suddenly carried implications beyond its immediate imprisonment. The truth emerged in fragments over hours of careful questioning. An infant cast away for imperfection. A fall through clouds towards certain death. A rescue by chance or mercy. Years hidden beneath waves while Olympus forgot what it had discarded, and now this. Not revenge exactly, though it tasted similar. Not hatred, though resentment surely lived in its design. A question made solid, an accounting demanded. A son reminding his mother that he remembered too, and that memory had learned to work metal. As evening settled across Olympus, Hera remained seated, bound by beauty, held by craft. Zeus stood beside her, his anger checked by the complexity of guilt and consequence. The other gods drifted away eventually, leaving the royal pair alone with their captured queen and the message she couldn't escape. In the depths, Hephaestus returned to work. The hammering resumed its rhythm, steady as heartbeats, patient as tides. He had sent his answer across the distance. Now he would wait for the reply, knowing it would come. Knowing, perhaps, that this story had only just found its proper beginning. The first messenger arrived at dawn, descending through layers of ocean that grew darker with each fathom. Hermes came as himself this time, no disguises, no transformations. His winged sandals carried him through the water as easily as through air, leaving trails of silver bubbles that rose like reversed rain toward the surface far above. He found the grotto unchanged. The same filtered light dancing across coral walls, the same gentle current moving through chambers carved from living rock. And at the center, the forge, glowing with heat that made the surrounding water shimmer and dance. Hephaestus worked at his anvil, hammer rising and falling with meditative precision. He was shaping something small, delicate, a gift perhaps for Thetis or Eurynome. The metal sang beneath his strikes, each blow exactly measured, exactly placed. He did not look up when Hermes entered, though he certainly knew of his presence. "Hephaestus," Hermes began, his voice carrying its usual charm, that honeyed quality that had smoothed countless difficult conversations. "Craftsman of the deep, I come bearing messages from Olympus, from Zeus himself." The hammer continued its rhythm. Strike. Pause. Strike. Pause. The metal glowed orange, then yellow, then white beneath the work. Hermes tried again, adjusting his approach. "Your work has caused quite a stir." The throne. Magnificent piece, truly. But perhaps you'd consider visiting Olympus. Zeus offers welcome, a place among the gods, recognition for your considerable talents. Strike. Pause. Strike. Pause. "There would be rewards," Hermes continued, his voice growing slightly strained. "A palace of your own design, resources beyond measure, access to materials mortals dream of. Zeus is generous to those who serve him well." Finally, Hephaestus set down his hammer. He lifted the piece he'd been working on, a bracelet of twisted silver that caught light like captured moonbeams. He examined it carefully, testing each joint, each clasp. Satisfied, he set it aside to cool, and only then turned to face the messenger. "Tell Zeus," he said, his voice rougher than Hermes expected, shaped by years of forge smoke and sea air, "that I am content here. My forge burns hot. My work progresses. I need nothing Olympus offers." Hermes blinked, clearly unprepared for such directness. "But the throne, surely you understand, it holds the Queen of Heaven." "This cannot stand. Zeus commands your presence." "Commands," Hephaestus repeated, tasting the word. "Tell me, when I fell, did Zeus command the winds to catch me? When I tumbled through clouds, helpless and small, did Olympus open its arms?" He turned back to his anvil. "I'll remain where arms opened willingly." Hermes left frustrated, his winged sandals cutting through water with less grace than before. The message he carried back would not please Zeus. Rejection from this forgotten maker, this god of no reputation, this cast-off child, now refusing the very recognition that had been denied him. Other messengers came in following days. Apollo arrived with offers of poetry, of songs that would celebrate Hephaestus's name. Athena appeared with propositions of shared workshops, mutual craft. Ares came with threats barely contained, speaking of forces that could drag him to Olympus in chains. To each, Hephaestus gave the same response: polite refusal. Gentle but absolute. He would not be commanded. He would not be bribed. He would not be threatened into accepting what should have been offered freely long ago. The grotto remained his sanctuary, and within its coral walls he needed nothing from gods who had forgotten him until his work demanded remembrance. Then, on the seventh day after Hermes' visit, someone different arrived. Dionysus descended through the depths, not with purpose or urgency, but with the wondering curiosity of one who has nowhere particular to be and infinite time to get there. He carried amphorae of wine that somehow remained perfectly chilled despite the volcanic warmth, and he settled himself on a smooth stone near the forge with the ease of an old friend, though they had never met. "I brought drinks," Dionysus announced cheerfully. "Seemed rude to visit empty-handed. Also, I was curious. They say you're being stubborn." Hephaestus glanced at him, then returned to his work, heating metal in the forge's heart. "They say many things." True enough. Dionysus poured wine into 2 cups he'd produced from nowhere in particular, the way he often did with useful items. "I was cast out once too, you know, not as an infant, but later. My mother was mortal, which scandalized Hera. Spent years wandering before Olympus acknowledged me." This time Hephaestus paused, hammer hovering. Something in Dionysus's tone carried authenticity the other messengers had lacked. "I'm not here to convince you," Dionysus continued, setting 1 cup within reach of the anvil. "Zeus sent me, yes, but I accepted because I was curious about someone who could refuse Olympus. That takes either tremendous courage or tremendous contentment. I wanted to know which." "Perhaps both," Hephaestus said quietly. He set down his hammer and took the offered cup. The wine was excellent, tasting of summer grapes and distant hillsides warmed by sun. They drank in comfortable silence, the only sound the gentle lapping of water against stone and the low rumble of the forge. Dionysus asked about techniques, about metals and their properties, about the volcanic heat and how one controlled such wild flame. His questions carried genuine interest, not diplomatic pretense. "The thing about Olympus," Dionysus said eventually, his voice thoughtful, "is that it's exhausting and glorious and terrible and necessary, all at once. The gods. There are wounded and wounding, magnificent and petty, capable of great beauty and casual cruelty, much like everywhere really, but with more lightning." Hephaestus almost smiled at that. Almost. "But," Dionysus continued, "some answers only exist in the places we left. Some conversations can only happen face to face, god to god, mother to son." He paused, swirling wine in his cup. "You don't have to forgive. You don't have to forget. But you might want to witness her response yourself, rather than hearing it second-hand through messengers who never quite tell the truth." The words settled between them like cooling metal, taking shape slowly. Hephaestus stared into his wine, seeing reflections distorted by ripples. "I remember falling," he said finally. "The clouds parting. The distance growing. I remember thinking, in whatever way infants think, that this was the world, that coldness and falling were simply how things were. And now you've made something warm instead," Dionysus said gently. "A forge, a home, work you love. That's its own answer. Yet you think I should return." "I think," Dionysus said, standing and leaving the second amphora beside the forge, "that you've asked a question in gold and mechanism. Questions deserve responses. Whether you like the answer is different, but hearing it, seeing it, being present for it, that has value too." He moved toward the grotto's entrance, water already beginning to embrace him for the journey upward. "The choice is yours, craftsman. It always was. That's the point, isn't it? This time you decide." After Dionysus left, Hephaestus sat for a long time beside his forge. The volcanic heat warmed his face, familiar as heartbeat, reliable as tide. This place had saved him, raised him, given him purpose. Leaving felt like betrayal. Yet Dionysus had spoken truth. The throne had been a question, and questions left unanswered became their own kind of trap, invisible as the mechanisms he'd designed, just as binding. He stood finally, moving through his workshop, touching tools he'd crafted, running fingers across the anvil worn smooth by years of use. Thetis found him there, understanding immediately what his expression meant. "You're going," she said softly, "for a time." He took her hands, these hands that had pulled him from drowning, that had taught him gentleness alongside strength. Not because they command, because I choose. Because some conversations can only happen in person. She nodded, drew him close, whispered blessing. Eurynome appeared as well, both of them seeing him off as they'd welcomed him, with love uncomplicated by expectation or obligation. The next morning, Hephaestus ascended from the depths, riding on the back of a creature Thetis had summoned, half dolphin, half something older. The water grew lighter, warmer, filled with dancing sunlight. Mists parted before him. Above, Olympus waited. Behind, the forge still burned. And ahead, his mother sat trapped in a question made gold, waiting for the answer only he could provide. The surface of the sea broke around him with barely a ripple, as if the water itself understood the significance of this moment and chose gentleness over drama. Hephaestus breathed air that tasted different from the grotto's filtered atmosphere, sharper somehow, filled with pine and stone, and something electric that might have been proximity to divine power. Or perhaps just anticipation. The creature beneath him, patient and silent, carried him toward the shore where olive trees grew thick and wild. Beyond them, the mountain rose, Olympus. Not merely tall, but impossible, reaching heights where snow and starlight mingled, where marble gleamed even through cloud cover, where the very air seemed to thicken with consequence. He slid from the creature's back into shallow water, the waves lapping at his uneven gait with familiar rhythm. Thetis's blessing still hummed in his chest, a warmth distinct from the forge heat he'd carried all his life. Behind him, the creature submerged with barely a sound, returning to depths that had been home. Ahead lay the path upward. Hephaestus began to climb. His movements held none of the fluid grace other gods possessed, that easy divine perfection that made even walking look like dance. His gait was uneven, always had been, always would be. One leg shorter, twisted from birth or fall, or simply divine caprice. But his arms were strong from hammerwork, his balance hard-earned from years at the anvil, and he climbed steadily, breathing deep of mountain air. The lower slopes held mortal olive groves, terraced and tended, then forests of oak and cedar where deer watched from shadow. Higher still, the trees thinned to scrub pine and finally to bare rock, that sparkled with minerals he recognized, metals sleeping in stone, waiting for hands skilled enough to wake them. He did not hurry. There was no need for haste when approaching destiny. As he climbed, he noticed how the light changed. Not gradually as it did in mortal lands, where sun tracked slowly across predictable sky, but in distinct layers. Below, morning light golden and thick as honey. Higher, afternoon brightness that held no shadows. Higher still, that peculiar Olympian radiance that came from nowhere and everywhere at once, as if the mountain itself exhaled illumination. The air grew thinner, but somehow easier to breathe, perfumed with ambrosia blossoms that grew only in divine altitudes. Their scent reminded him of Hera's gardens, memories he didn't know he possessed, infant recollections that surfaced now like dream fragments. Finally, the path leveled. Clouds parted like curtains drawn by invisible hands, and there, vast and impossible, and somehow exactly as his sleeping mind had always known it would be, stood Olympus proper. Marble columns rose higher than redwoods, their surfaces carved with scenes of cosmic order, each frieze telling stories of the gods' triumph over titans, over chaos, over anything that dared challenge divine supremacy. The palace sprawled across the mountaintop like a city unto itself, connected courtyards and soaring halls, fountains that flowed with water sweeter than wine, gardens where flowers bloomed in colors that had no mortal names. And there, assembled in the central courtyard, The gods waited. Hephaestus saw them all at once and individually, each divine presence distinct as separate flames. Zeus upon his throne, lightning barely contained beneath bronze skin, beard dark as storm cloud, eyes that held both welcome and calculation. Poseidon beside him, sea scent clinging to his robes, trident catching light in ways that made the eyes ache. Hades in shadow, despite the brightness, patient and still as deep earth. The goddesses too. Athena watching with grey eyes that seemed to catalogue everything, wisdom barely containing curiosity. Artemis with her hunting bow, looking faintly bored by divine politics. Demeter, grain-crowned and gentle, who nodded slightly as if recognizing something in him that others missed. And there, still seated upon the golden throne, unable to rise, face carefully composed but eyes betraying her, Hera. The assembled gods fell silent as Hephaestus entered the courtyard. His footsteps echoed against marble, uneven rhythm announcing his approach. He carried no weapon, wore no finery, appeared exactly as he was, a craftsman called from his workshop, flame-scent clinging to simple tunic, soot still darkening his fingernails. He crossed the courtyard slowly, aware of every watching eye, every held breath, every god leaning forward slightly to witness this moment. Some expressions held curiosity, others shame, still others relief that the awkward situation might finally resolve. He ignored them all, his gaze fixed on the figure trapped in gold. Hera watched him approach. Her face, famous throughout creation for its perfect beauty, showed nothing. But her hands gripped the throne's arms, knuckles white despite divine bronze skin, betraying tension her expression refused to acknowledge. Hephaestus stopped 3 paces away. Close enough to see her clearly, far enough to maintain distinction. Mother and son, goddess and craftsman, 2 beings connected by blood and abandonment, meeting now across a gulf measured in years and gold. Hephaestus, Zeus began, voice rolling like thunder barely restrained, you have returned to. I would speak with her, Hephaestus said quietly, not rudely but firmly, his voice carrying surprising authority. Alone. Zeus paused, clearly unaccustomed to interruption. But something in Hephaestus's tone, or perhaps the sheer strangeness of the situation, made him nod slowly. The throne room, he decreed. Privacy granted. The other gods withdrew, some reluctantly, others with relief. Footsteps echoed and faded. Fountains continued their gentle music. And then, silence. Hephaestus and Hera, alone together for the first time since his infancy, studied each other across the space between them. You've grown, Hera said finally, her voice softer than he'd expected, lacking the imperious tone she used with other gods. I lived, he replied. Not accusation, just fact. The throne is beautiful, she continued, fingers tracing golden armrests that held her captive. Your craftsmanship exceeds even the legends. It serves its purpose. Another silence, longer this time, heavy with everything unsaid. Finally Hera spoke again, words emerging slowly as if each one cost her something. I cannot claim to have thought of you often, in the years between. I could offer excuses, divine concerns, the demands of queenship. But truthfully, I tried to forget. It was easier than remembering. Hephaestus nodded slowly. Honesty, at least. That was something. Why did you make this? She asked, gesturing at the throne with movement the mechanism permitted. Revenge? Anger? Justice? He considered the question seriously. The same question he'd asked himself countless times while crafting it. Perhaps a little of each, he admitted. But mostly, I think, I wanted you to understand what it felt like, to be held in place not by chains or walls, but by something beautiful that won't let you go. Understanding flickered in her eyes. She looked at him differently then, seeing perhaps not the flawed infant she'd discarded, but the god he'd become despite her. Or because of her. Both truths existed simultaneously. "Will you release me?" she asked. Hephaestus moved forward, studying the mechanism he'd crafted so carefully in his underwater forge. His fingers found the hidden catch, the precise pressure point that would spring the trap. So simple, really. One touch, and she'd be free. He paused there, hand resting on cool gold, aware that everything hinged on this moment. Then, without ceremony or speech, he pressed the release. The golden arms opened smoothly, silently, perfect mechanism responding to its creator's touch. Hera rose slowly, rubbing wrists that bore no marks but remembered constraint. She stood before him, queen and mother, goddess and stranger. "Thank you," she whispered. They stood there in the empty throne room, two divine beings separated by history and joined by blood, neither certain what came next. Outside, the other gods waited. But here, in this moment of privacy granted by Zeus's decree, only truth remained. Hephaestus nodded once, acknowledgement rather than absolution. Some wounds heal, others simply scar over, becoming part of the landscape of who we are. "Zeus offered me a place here," he said finally, "among the Olympians. Will you accept?" He looked around the throne room, at its impossible beauty, its perfect proportions, its cold marble perfection. Then he thought of his forge, of volcanic warmth and the rhythm of hammer on anvil, of Thetis's gentle hands and Eurynome's patient teaching. "I will visit," he decided. "I will craft for Olympus when needed, but my forge lies elsewhere, in Fireheart depths where I choose to dwell. I'll be Olympian, if that's what's required, but I won't live here." Hera nodded slowly. Perhaps she understood. Perhaps she simply accepted. Either way, she inclined her head, gesture carrying weight that words could not. "That seems wise, my son, my son." The words hung in air between them, acknowledged at last, carrying all their complicated weight. He left the throne room without ceremony, passing through corridors where gods had returned to their usual occupations, pretending they hadn't been listening at doorways moments before. Zeus nodded to him from across a courtyard. Athena watched with grey eyes that seemed to understand more than most. Apollo played his lyre somewhere, melody drifting through columned spaces like light through water. Hephaestus walked the length of Olympus, feeling marble beneath uneven steps, and with each footfall he confirmed what he'd already known. This was not his home. Beautiful, yes. Perfect, certainly. But perfection left no room for the kind of creation he needed, the work that required heat and darkness and transformation. He descended from the mountain as dawn broke across the mortal world below. The path downward felt easier somehow, as if gravity recognized his decision. At the base, where olive groves gave way to rockier ground, he paused and looked not toward the sea that had sheltered him, but south and east toward a different horizon. There, barely visible through morning haze, a mountain breathed smoke into the sky. Mount Etna. Ancient, volatile, its peak crowned with ash and promise. Mortals feared it. They told stories of monsters imprisoned beneath, of Earth's anger made visible. But Hephaestus saw something else entirely. He saw opportunity. He saw home. The journey took 3 days by mortal reckoning, though divine travel bends time strangely. He passed through valleys where shepherds watched their flocks, through villages where people whispered prayers to gods who might or might not be listening. None recognized the limping traveler as divine. He preferred it that way. Etna grew larger with each step until it dominated the horizon completely. Up close, the mountain revealed itself differently than from distance. Its slopes bore the scars of previous eruptions, black stone rivers frozen mid-flow, ash fields where nothing grew. But higher up, near the caldera's edge, heat shimmered in ways that made his heart quicken with recognition. He climbed. Not the easy paths that mortals might use, but straight up through lava fields and sulfur vents, through places where rock remained warm enough to hurt unprotected feet. His divine nature shielded him, but he felt the heat nonetheless, welcomed it like greeting from an old friend. At the summit's rim, he looked down into the volcano's throat. Deep below, magma churned and glowed, the Earth's blood circulating through channels older than Olympus itself. The air tasted of metal and possibility. Every breath carried the scent of transformation. This, he thought, this is where I belong. He descended into the caldera, finding natural chambers within the mountain's structure. The Cyclopes who dwelt in these depths emerged cautiously at first, single eyes widening with recognition. They knew him somehow, perhaps remembered his fall from Olympus, perhaps simply recognized divinity when they saw it. "I want to build a forge," Hephaestus told them. "The greatest forge that has ever existed. Will you help?" The Cyclopes, who had labored in darkness for ages uncounted, looked at each other and then nodded. Work began immediately. They carved chambers from living rock, expanding natural caverns into cathedral spaces where smoke could rise and heat could build. They channeled lava flows through stone troughs, creating rivers of fire that could be directed, controlled, made to serve rather than destroy. The largest chamber became the heart of everything, a space vast enough that echoes took heartbeats to return. In this central forge room, Hephaestus built his primary anvil. Not from ordinary stone, but from a meteorite he'd discovered on his journey, star iron, that had fallen from the heavens themselves. He shaped it carefully, smoothing its surface until it rang true when struck, a note that resonated through the entire mountain. Around the anvil he arranged his tools. Some he'd brought from his underwater grotto, gifts from Thetis wrapped in seaweed and coral. Others he crafted new, hammer for hammer, tong for tong, each one perfectly weighted for its purpose. The Cyclopes contributed their own implements, massive versions scaled to their size, and together the tools filled racks that lined every wall. But tools alone don't make a forge complete. Hephaestus needed assistants, beings who could work tirelessly without complaint, who understood the rhythm of creation as he did. So he turned to the craft he'd mastered beneath the sea and began his most ambitious project yet. He gathered gold, vast quantities brought by the Cyclopes from secret mines deep within the mountain. He gathered silver for joints and bronze for structural strength. Working through days and nights that blurred together in the timeless heat of the forge, he shaped the first of his golden automatons. She emerged from fire and careful hammering, a figure in female form, but clearly not mortal, not quite divine either. Gold skin caught forged light and held it, reflecting warmth without burning. Silver joints moved with impossible smoothness, silent and precise. Her face bore no expression, yet suggested patience, willingness, purpose without pride. When he breathed life into her, not breath exactly, but something similar, divine essence mixed with craftsmanship's love, her eyes opened. Not seeing as mortals see, but aware nonetheless. She rose from the workbench, took 3 experimental steps, and then nodded to him, gesture of readiness. He made more. 4 in total, each slightly different, each perfect in function. They moved through the forge like dancers, learning its geography, understanding instinctively where tools belonged, how heat flowed when metal reached the crucial moment for shaping. They never tired, never complained, never required anything beyond purpose. With the Cyclopes providing strength and the automatons providing precision, Hephaestus's forge became fully operational. The mountain breathed differently now, its exhalations synchronized with the work happening within. Smoke that rose from Etna's peak carried different qualities, tinged with metals and ambition. He began with simple projects, relearning rhythms he'd developed underwater, adapting them to volcanic heat rather than ocean pressure. A sword first, plain but perfectly balanced, edge that would never dull. then a shield, its surface polished until it could serve as mirror, then a cup, simple bronze, but shaped so perfectly that wine poured into it tasted better somehow. Each piece taught him something. The volcanic heat was more intense than any fire he'd worked with before, but also more responsive. It obeyed his will in ways that seemed almost alive. The lava streams could be cooled suddenly by channeling seawater through stone pipes the Cyclopes had installed, creating temperature changes that transformed metal's properties in fascinating ways. As he worked, the forge filled with sounds that became his constant companions. The deep breathing of the mountain itself, steady and eternal. The hiss of metal meeting water. The ringing of hammer on anvil, each strike a note in compositions that lasted days. The whisper of automatons moving, gold feet on stone floors. The occasional rumble of the Cyclopes' voices, discussing their own projects in the deeper chambers. Time moved strangely here. Days and nights meant little when forge light provided constant illumination. Seasons changed outside, but within the mountain, only work mattered. Hephaestus found himself entering states of creation where hours vanished, where he'd start a piece at what might be dawn and look up to find stars visible through ventilation shafts, though he couldn't remember the sun crossing the sky. The gods of Olympus began to hear rumors. Mortals reported seeing the mountain glow with unusual intensity. Sailors passing Sicily spoke of sounds like thunder, but rhythmic, purposeful. Hermes, always curious, descended to investigate and found himself standing at the forge's entrance, amazed by what he saw. "Brother," he called out, voice barely audible over the hammering, "Zeus sent me to see if you're still alive." Hephaestus looked up from his work, face streaked with soot, eyes bright with fire reflection. He smiled, gesture that transformed his features entirely. "Very much alive," he replied. "Tell Zeus his thunderbolts will be ready soon," for that was his first true commission, the work that would establish his role among the Olympians. Zeus required weapons, lightning made solid, and Hephaestus alone possessed the skill to craft them. Each bolt required days of work, tempering and retempering, balancing power with control, ensuring they'd return to Zeus's hand after being thrown. He crafted 3, first testing different approaches. The first was pure power, bright and terrible, capable of splitting mountains. The second carried precision, able to strike a single target while leaving everything around it untouched. The third combined both qualities, balanced and terrible, the perfect weapon for the king of gods. When Hermes carried them to Olympus, Zeus tested them immediately. The sky above the divine mountain lit with sudden storms, thunder rolling across regions that had been clear moments before. Satisfied, Zeus sent word back. "More. Keep making them. Whatever you require, you shall have." And so Hephaestus's true work began. The commission transformed everything. Before Zeus's order, Hephaestus had been a craftsman working for himself, for the simple joy of making. Now he was something different. Essential. The gods needed him in ways they'd never needed anyone, save perhaps Zeus himself. It was strange being wanted after so long being unwanted, but he found the feeling suited him well enough. Word traveled quickly on Olympus. If the king of gods required Hephaestus's skill, then surely others might benefit as well. Within days of the thunderbolt's delivery, Poseidon arrived at the mountain, sea spray still clinging to his beard, eyes as restless as tides. "I hear my brother has commissioned weapons," he said without preamble. The sea demands equal consideration. Hephaestus studied him across the anvil. Poseidon carried himself with the confidence of one who'd never been refused anything, yet underneath ran currents of uncertainty. Second sun, second throne. Always Zeus's shadow, even at the bottom of the ocean. "What does the sea need?" Hephaestus asked. "Something that speaks with my voice," Poseidon replied. "When I strike the ocean floor, the world should know." So Hephaestus crafted the trident. Not 3 prongs simply welded together, but a single piece of metal folded and reforged countless times until its structure resembled waves themselves, layer upon layer, each one flowing into the next. He used silver harvested from deep-sea vents, mixed with copper that carried green patina like ocean depths, tempered in water drawn from the coldest abyss. The work took longer than Zeus's thunderbolts because Poseidon's weapon required different qualities. Not explosion, but resonance. When struck against stone, it should sing with the ocean's voice, calling forth waves, stirring currents, speaking to every creature that swam or crawled beneath the surface. The automatons helped, their golden hands steady as Hephaestus worked the intricate patterns into the trident's surface. Waves, yes, but also fish scales, coral formations, the spiral of shells, everything the sea contained. When finished, the weapon thrummed with power even at rest, as if water itself flowed through the metal. Poseidon hefted it, and his expression transformed. Satisfaction, pride, something almost like gratitude. "The sea thanks you, nephew," he said, and the title carried weight, acknowledgement of family, of belonging. After Poseidon came others. Athena arrived requesting armor, though she didn't specify for whom. Hephaestus crafted a breastplate that moved like water, scales overlapping so smoothly that arrows would slide off rather than pierce. Helios sent word he needed a new chariot, the old one showing wear after millennia of carrying the sun. Hephaestus designed wheels that would never tire, axles that required no oil, reins woven from gold thread that wouldn't burn under solar heat. Each commission taught him more. He learned that different gods required different approaches. Zeus wanted power that could be seen, lightning that declared authority. Poseidon needed resonance, weapons that spoke to his domain. Athena valued function over beauty, though she appreciated when both combined. Apollo desired elegance, everything crafted to aesthetic perfection. For Apollo, he made a lyre whose strings never broke, producing notes so pure that birds fell silent to listen. For Artemis, arrows that flew true regardless of wind, and a bow that adjusted to the archer's strength, never too stiff, never too loose. For Dionysus, wine cups that enhanced flavor, making even poor vintage taste like ambrosia. The forge became a place of pilgrimage. Gods who had barely acknowledged him now sought audiences, bringing requests, offerings, desperate needs. Hephaestus worked steadily through them all, taking pleasure not in their attention, but in the problems they presented. How to craft armor that changed size with its wearer. How to make a crown that wouldn't tarnish. How to forge chains that even gods couldn't break. Between divine commissions, he created for himself. Small things, experiments, objects that served no purpose except to exist beautifully. A bronze nightingale that sang when touched. A silver rose that never wilted. A mechanical fish that swam through the air as if it were water. These pieces he kept in a side chamber, his private collection, things made purely for the joy of making. The automatons watched him work with their strange, not quite awareness. Sometimes he wondered what they thought, if thought was even the right word for what happened behind their golden faces. They learned constantly, anticipating his needs before he voiced them, adjusting techniques he'd shown them once, making small improvements he hadn't requested. One evening, as volcanic night settled outside and forged light-painted shadows on stone walls, one of the automatons approached him. She carried a hammer he'd been searching for, holding it out with both hands, and for a moment her face seemed almost to express something. Concern, perhaps, or simple attention. Then the impression passed, and she was merely golden artifice again, beautiful and empty. "Thank you," he said anyway, taking the hammer. She nodded once and returned to her station, but the moment lingered. Company, even mechanical company, proved better than solitude. The Cyclopes worked in deeper chambers, their project shrouded in mystery even from him. Sometimes their hammering synchronized with his, creating rhythms that made the entire mountain resonate like an enormous drum. Other times they sang, voices deeper than earthquakes, songs in languages older than Greek, older perhaps than language itself. Zeus visited once, appearing without warning at the forge entrance, lightning crackling around his shoulders more from habit than threat. He walked slowly through the workshop, examining tools, studying half-finished projects, saying nothing. Finally he stopped at the central anvil, the meteorite star iron, and ran his hand across its surface. "This place suits you," he said. Hephaestus waited, unsure what response was expected. "On Olympus they whisper that you're happier here than you'd be among us," Zeus continued. "Some find that insulting." "I mean no insult," Hephaestus replied carefully. "I know." Zeus turned to face him fully. "You mean nothing except your work. That's what makes you invaluable. No schemes, no ambitions, just craft." He paused. "Hera asks after you sometimes." The words hung in the air between them like cooling metal, solid and awkward. "Tell her I'm well," Hephaestus said finally. Zeus nodded and departed, lightning briefly illuminating the mountain's interior before fading. The visit left Hephaestus unsettled, though he couldn't articulate why. Acceptance felt strange, heavier than rejection somehow, carrying obligations he hadn't anticipated. Still, the work continued. That was the mountain's gift, perhaps its only truth. Here in the forge, surrounded by fire and purpose, he was exactly what he needed to be. Not the rejected child, not the deformed god. Simply the maker, the craftsman, essential and valued and, in his own particular way, content. The hammer sang against the anvil. The automatons moved in their eternal dance. The mountain breathed its patient breath. And somewhere far above, on Olympus's bright peak, gods wore the armor he'd made, wielded the weapons he'd forged, and knew they depended on him. It was enough. For now, it was more than enough. Zeus's words lingered longer than his lightning. For days afterward, Hephaestus found himself pausing mid-strike, hammer raised, thinking about obligations and what acceptance truly meant. The forge hadn't changed. Fire still burned with the same intensity, metal still bent to the same principles. Yet something had shifted in the air, subtle as smoke, persistent as heat. He was working on a commission for Demeter when the summons arrived. Not a request this time, but something different. Hermes appeared at the entrance, wind-tousled and grinning, carrying a sealed scroll marked with Zeus's thunderbolt. "Official business," Hermes announced, tossing the scroll casually. "Father's arranged a marriage." "Congratulations, I think." The scroll landed on the workbench. Hephaestus stared at it, not reaching. "Marriage?" "Aphrodite," Hermes said, and his grin faltered slightly. "Born from sea foam, goddess of beauty, desire, all those complicated things. You've heard of her. Everyone had heard of her. Even in the forge's isolation, stories reached him. Aphrodite who made gods stumble over their own feet. Aphrodite whose laughter caused flowers to bloom. Aphrodite who was beauty itself made manifest and walking. "Why?" Hephaestus asked quietly. Hermes shrugged. Zeus's logic. "You've proven yourself invaluable. This is honor, recognition. She needs a husband, you need a wife. Divine mathematics." He paused. "The wedding's in 3 days. Olympus, naturally. Everyone's invited." Then he was gone, leaving only the scroll and its impossible words. Hephaestus opened it slowly. The language was formal, ceremonial, each phrase perfectly composed. Zeus decreed. Hera approved. Aphrodite consented, which probably meant she'd been given no more choice than he had. The marriage would unite craft and beauty, function and form, creating harmony between essential forces. He set the scroll aside and returned to Demeter's commission, but his hands felt uncertain now. The hammer struck wrong angles. The metal refused to cooperate. Finally he stopped, set down his tools, and simply stood in the forge's heat, trying to understand what he felt. Not joy, though perhaps he should feel that. Not anger either. Something closer to confusion, mixed with an unexpected flutter of hope that embarrassed him. Marriage. Partnership. The possibility of not being alone. The automatons watched him with their golden faces. One approached, touched his arm gently, a gesture she'd never made before. He looked at her, wondering again what happened behind those crafted eyes. "I know," he said. "It's complicated." 3 days passed like 3 hours. He crafted a gift for his bride, working through nights lit only by lava's glow. A necklace of silver and pearl, each link a perfect miniature wave, the clasp a tiny dolphin with emerald eyes. Beauty to honor beauty, craft to complement grace. His hands knew what to do even when his mind stayed clouded. The Cyclopes emerged from their deep chambers to see him off, their single eyes solemn. They said nothing, but one handed him a cloak woven from thread so fine it might have been starlight. Another gave him new sandals, crafted to accommodate his uneven gait without being obvious about it. "Come back," one said simply. "Always," Hephaestus promised. Olympus glittered in the distance as he ascended. He'd forgotten how bright it was, how everything gleamed with divine polish. Gods and goddesses filled the great hall, their beauty casual and absolute. They turned as he entered, conversations dying briefly before resuming at lower volume. He found his place at the center of attention, hating every moment of it. Then Aphrodite entered, and the world seemed to quiet in a different way. She was everything the stories promised, and nothing he could have prepared for. Her hair caught light and transformed it. Her eyes held depths that made the sea seem shallow. She moved like music given form, each step a verse in some unheard song. She met his gaze across the hall, and he saw something there.
Not love, they were strangers.
Not even desire. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps resignation. Perhaps simple recognition that they were both pieces in a larger game. The ceremony was beautiful because everything on Olympus was beautiful. Hera presided, her expression unreadable. Zeus beamed with the satisfaction of someone solving problems through divine decree. Other gods watched with varying degrees of interest and pity. Ares, god of war, stood near the back, his eyes never leaving Aphrodite. Hephaestus noticed but didn't understand. Not yet. Aphrodite's hand was soft in his as they spoke the binding words. Her voice carried harmonies that made his chest ache. When she smiled politely at him, he felt both blessed and completely out of place. The feast that followed blurred together. Gods congratulated him with words that felt hollow. Aphrodite sat beside him, gracious and distant, speaking little. She admired the necklace he'd made, clasping it around her throat where it looked perfect, inevitable, like he'd always intended it for her. "It's beautiful," she said, and her tone held genuine appreciation. "You have remarkable skill." "Thank you," he managed. "Zeus said you built everything," she continued, gesturing vaguely toward the hall. "The columns, the metalwork, even the foundations." "Most of it," he confirmed. She studied him then, really looked at him perhaps for the first time. "That must be satisfying, creating permanent things." "It is," he said, and found himself wanting to explain. "Metal remembers what you teach it. Stone holds what you tell it to hold. They're honest materials." Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth exactly, but interest. "I'd never thought about it that way." They talked briefly about craft and beauty, form and function. Small moments of genuine connection flickered between them like sparks from struck steel. Perhaps, Hephaestus thought, perhaps this could work. Perhaps different kinds of beauty could coexist. Perhaps loneliness could transform into companionship given time and patience. The feast ended as dawn approached. Aphrodite rose gracefully, and he rose with her, following her to chambers Zeus had prepared. She paused at the threshold, turned to him, and for a moment vulnerability showed through her divine composure.
"This is strange for both of us," she said quietly.
"Yes," he agreed. "Perhaps we can be kind to each other," she offered. "Even if we didn't choose this." "I'd like that," Hephaestus said, and meant it completely. She touched his face briefly, gently, then entered the chamber. He followed, hoping that kindness might be enough. That small moments might accumulate into something real, that even arranged marriages might grow into understanding if both parties worked at it with the same dedication he brought to forging bronze. The night passed. Morning came. And for a brief span of time, measured in days that felt almost peaceful, Hephaestus allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, he'd finally found a home that wasn't built from fire and stone. The days that followed passed in uncertain rhythm, neither terrible nor entirely comfortable, like metal still finding its shape. Hephaestus moved between two worlds now, the forge beneath Mount Etna and the marble chambers of Olympus where his wife resided. The distance between them felt both geographical and impossible to measure. Aphrodite treated him with consistent politeness. She never flinched from his uneven gait, never looked away from his soot-stained hands. She asked questions about his work with what seemed genuine interest, though her eyes sometimes drifted toward windows, toward sky, toward anywhere but here. He tried not to notice. He tried very hard. Some mornings he'd find her brushing her hair, sunlight streaming through gossamer curtains, and the sight would stop his breath. She'd smile then, not unkindly, and ask about his plans for the day. He'd tell her about the shield he was crafting or the new technique for tempering bronze, and she'd listen with the same gracious attention she gave everyone. "You should visit the forge," he offered once. "See where the work happens. Perhaps," she said, in the tone that meant no without saying it directly. He returned to Lemnos more frequently than he remained on Olympus. The volcanic heat welcomed him back, the Cyclopes greeting him with nods and resumed hammer strikes. His automatons moved in their familiar patterns, requiring no explanation, expecting no conversation. Here, everything made sense. Metal obeyed consistent laws. Fire burned predictably. Creation followed logic. Still, he crafted gifts for Aphrodite. A mirror, whose bronze surface never tarnished, reflecting her beauty without distortion. Earrings shaped like roses, each petal individually worked until they seemed ready to unfurl. A circlet that caught light and scattered it in colors unnamed. She accepted each piece with genuine delight, wore them with grace that made his heart ache. "You're too generous," she told him, fingers tracing the circlet's delicate curves.
"I like making things," he said simply.
"Especially beautiful things." She looked at him then with something almost like sadness. "I know you do." The other gods watched their marriage with varying degrees of amusement and pity. Hera's expression remained carefully neutral whenever they appeared together. Zeus seemed pleased with his solution, oblivious to any underlying tension. Athena visited the forge once, her grey eyes knowing, but she said nothing about his wife. She simply worked beside him as always, two craftspeople finding peace in shared purpose. Dionysus stopped by with wine and knowing smiles. "Marriage treating you well, friend?" "It's an adjustment," Hephaestus replied carefully. "Aphrodite is kind to you." "Very kind," he said, and meant it. Kindness was what they promised each other. Kindness was what they maintained. That it wasn't love hardly mattered. Love, he'd learned, wasn't something one could forge, no matter how skilled the smith. Time passed in Olympian fashion, days bleeding into weeks without clear distinction. Hephaestus fell into patterns. Work in the forge until exhaustion demanded rest, return to Olympus where Aphrodite maintained their household with divine grace, share meals in polite near silence, retire to separate sleeping chambers that Zeus's architecture had conveniently provided. She never asked him to stay. He never offered. The unspoken arrangement suited them both, But something had begun to shift, subtle as metal fatigue, invisible until the break comes. Aphrodite grew distant in ways he couldn't quite name. She smiled less, spoke in shorter phrases, spent long hours walking Olympus's gardens alone. When he asked if something troubled her, she assured him all was well. He believed her because he wanted to. Because the alternative meant acknowledging what his hands already knew, what craftsmen learn from working with flawed materials. Some things break regardless of care. Some unions, no matter how beautifully formed, contain invisible weaknesses. Helios arrived at the forge on a morning thick with volcanic heat. The sun god rarely descended to these depths, preferring his daily journey across the sky. His presence alone suggested significance. "Brother," Helios said, though they weren't brothers by blood, merely in divine courtesy. Hephaestus set down his hammer. "What brings you here?" Helios hesitated, an unusual quality in a god who witnessed everything and spoke of it freely. "There's something you should know, something I've seen." The words that followed came slowly, carefully chosen, delivered with unexpected gentleness. Helios described what his all-seeing gaze had witnessed. Aphrodite and Ares meeting in hidden groves while Olympus slept. Conversations that became embraces. Beauty and war-finding compatibility that beauty and craft apparently lacked. The affair had continued for weeks, perhaps longer. Hephaestus listened without moving. The forge fires burned. The automatons continued their work. The Cyclopes hammered metal in distant chambers, their rhythm unchanged. "I thought you should hear it from someone who respects you," Helios finished quietly, rather than discovering it through mockery or pity. "Thank you," Hephaestus said. His voice sounded normal, distant, like someone else speaking through his mouth. Helios departed. The forge continued its eternal rhythm. And Hephaestus stood motionless, staring at cooling bronze, mind working through information as methodically as he worked through any problem requiring solution. He felt no rage. That surprised him. Perhaps he'd always known on some level, the way metal knows its own weaknesses before they manifest. Aphrodite had never promised love. She'd promised kindness, and she'd delivered exactly that. The rest, her heart, her desire, those had never been offered, so how could they be betrayed? Still, acknowledgement settled in his chest like swallowed stone. Ares. Of course Ares. War god, beautiful in brutal ways, Hephaestus could never manage. Strong legs, unmarred skin, easy laughter. Everything that came effortlessly to him had required Hephaestus's entire life to partially achieve. He returned to his work because work was what he knew. But his hands moved with different purpose now. He didn't forge weapons or decorative beauty. Instead, he crafted something else entirely, a net. Gossamer, fine chains woven with techniques he'd never shared, even with the Cyclopes. Metal so light it floated on air currents, so strong it could hold gods themselves. He worked through the night, through the following day, through time measured only in hammer strikes and whispered calculations. The net grew between his fingers, invisible unless light caught it precisely right, delicate as spider silk and unbreakable as fate. When finished, he held it up to volcanic light. It shimmered like heat haze, barely present, absolutely real, perfect trap for those who thought themselves above consequence. He returned to Olympus carrying the net bundled small enough to hide in one palm. Aphrodite greeted him pleasantly, mentioned she'd be retiring early, seemed tired from the day's activities. He nodded, said he had work remaining in his personal workshop, would join her later perhaps. She smiled with relief, so brief he almost missed it. He went to their bedchamber and worked in silence, hanging the net above the bed with techniques learned from years of supporting weight invisibly. The chains spread across the ceiling, waiting, patient as only crafted things can be. Then he left, announcing loudly enough to be overheard that he'd returned to Lemnos for 3 days. Important commission from Zeus himself couldn't be delayed. Apologies for the absence. He departed through the main gates, then circled back unseen, his knowledge of Olympus's architecture providing hidden passages no other god remembered. He'd built these halls. He knew every secret they contained. Night deepened. The chamber remained empty. Then footsteps approached, 2 sets, voices hushed with secrecy and anticipation. The door opened. Aphrodite entered, and behind her Ares, god of war, beautiful and thoughtless and utterly unprepared. They moved toward the bed, still clothed but intentions obvious. They didn't notice the shimmer above them, the trap waiting like held breath. The net fell with no sound at all, just the whisper of air displaced by something too fine to catch light properly. One moment, the space above the bed held only darkness. The next, invisible chains wrapped around 2 divine forms with the certainty of roots finding water. Ares reacted first, muscles tensing with warrior instinct. He tried to move, to step back, but the gossamer threads had already settled across his shoulders, his arms, binding him as gently as they bound, absolutely. Aphrodite gasped, reaching toward him, and her hands too were caught, suspended mid-gesture in chains she couldn't see but could certainly feel. They struggled briefly, confusion shifting to understanding, then to something resembling fear. The net didn't hurt. It simply held, responsive to each movement with equal and opposite containment. The harder they pulled, the more certainly the chains embraced them. Hephaestus emerged from shadow, limping into view with measured steps. His face showed nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, not pain, just the expression of a craftsman observing whether his work performed as designed. "It holds well," he said quietly, studying the net's configuration. "I wondered if divine strength might find weaknesses." Apparently not. Aphrodite's eyes met his across the dim chamber. "Hephaestus," she began, voice unsteady in ways that beauty rarely permitted.
"Please."
"Let us explain."
"Explain what?"
His tone remained neutral as unworked bronze. "That you sought warmth elsewhere while I offered it here? That Ares provided something I apparently could not? These things require no explanation. They simply are. Ares, to his credit, didn't offer excuses. Warriors understood when battles were already lost. He simply stood still within the net's embrace, watching Hephaestus with wary respect. "What you intend?" Ares asked directly. Hephaestus considered this. The forge fires of Etna called to him distantly, urging return to simpler problems of heat and metal. But something needed witnessing here. Not vengeance exactly. Just acknowledgement that events had occurred, that hurt existed, that even gods couldn't wish reality into different shapes. "I intend," he said slowly, "to invite the others to see what I've seen. That's all. Witness, not punishment." Before either could respond, he raised his voice, carrying it through Olympus's halls with the resonance of struck bronze. "Come see. Come see the goddess of love and the god of war, caught in truest form. Come witness what the sun god sees, what the husband sees, what remains when beauty stops pretending." The words echoed. Distant sounds approached, footsteps, voices, divine curiosity drawing the Olympians like moths to flame. They arrived in pairs and groups, assembling in the chamber with expressions ranging from shock to sympathy to poorly concealed amusement. Zeus appeared last, regal and uncomfortable, clearly wishing to be elsewhere, but compelled by kingly duty to address situations that demanded addressing. Hera stood beside him, her face unreadable, though perhaps something flickered there that resembled understanding. She'd known betrayal's particular weight often enough. The assembled gods regarded the trapped pair in silence. Apollo shifted awkwardly. Hermes studied the net's construction with professional appreciation. Poseidon frowned, looking between Hephaestus and the prisoners as though calculating complex equations of justice and family politics. Athena arrived quietly, positioning herself near Hephaestus without speaking. Her presence alone conveyed support. She understood craft's precision, the care required to transform hurt into something productive rather than destructive. "Well," Zeus said eventually, voice carrying the weariness of ages spent mediating divine complications, "this is unfortunate." "Unfortunate," Hephaestus repeated, tasting the word. "Yes." "That seems accurate." "Release them," Zeus commanded, though his tone suggested request more than order. "And then?" Hephaestus asked. "Pretend this didn't occur. Suggest I simply accept what kindness was offered and ignore what companionship was withheld." "What would you have instead?" Hera's voice cut through, surprisingly gentle. "Punishment? Humiliation? These things satisfy briefly, then leave only ash." Hephaestus looked at her, his mother who'd once cast him from Olympus, who understood rejection's particular architecture. Their eyes met across the chamber, and something passed between them. Not forgiveness still, perhaps never that, but recognition. They'd both learned how hurt transforms into different shapes depending on how it's worked. "I would have," Hephaestus said carefully, acknowledgement. "That this happened, that I am here, present, aware. That invisible doesn't mean non-existent." "You have it," Aphrodite said quietly from within the net. "Hephaestus, you have it. I see you. I always saw you. I simply couldn't feel what you hoped I'd feel. That's not deception. That's just truth." The words settled like cooling metal. Hephaestus stood silent, processing this admission, the way he processed all complex information, methodically, completely. She was right, he realized. She'd never lied. She'd been kind, polite, gracious. She'd simply never loved him. Pretending otherwise would have been the actual betrayal. He raised one hand. The net responded immediately, chains loosening, withdrawing, folding back into themselves until they hung invisible once more above the bed. Aphrodite and Ares stood free, neither moving immediately, uncertain what came next. "The marriage is ended," Hephaestus announced to the assembled Olympians. "Dissolved by mutual recognition that some unions, however well crafted, simply don't hold. Let Zeus record it formally. Let Hera witness it properly. Let it be finished." Zeus nodded slowly, relief evident. "So it shall be." The union dissolved, both parties released from obligation. He paused. "The net, however, is impressive work. You'll leave it hanging?" Despite everything, Hephaestus almost smiled. "No." "I'll reclaim it. Useful techniques involved. Shame to waste them on permanent monument to temporary pain." The crowd began dispersing, gods retreating to their own concerns with the efficiency of those escaping awkward family gatherings. Ares left first, moving quickly despite divine composure. Aphrodite lingered briefly, searching for words that didn't exist, then followed. Soon only Athena remained, standing beside Hephaestus in the emptying chamber. "You handled that well," she said quietly. "Did I?" He felt exhausted suddenly, as though he'd worked the forge for weeks without rest. "I'm not certain what well looks like in these circumstances. It looks like what you did. Dignity. Clarity. Transformation of hurt into action without cruelty." She touched his shoulder briefly. "That's craft too, in its way." They stood together in comfortable silence, two makers understanding what others rarely grasped. That creation and destruction were related arts. That knowing when to release was as important as knowing when to hold. That even gods must sometimes admit when their work hasn't succeeded. Eventually, Hephaestus returned to Etna. The forge welcomed him with familiar heat, the Cyclopes greeting him with surprised delight at his earlier-than-expected return. The automatons continued their eternal tasks, metal singing against metal, rhythm restoring him to himself. He didn't work immediately. Instead, he sat among warm stones, letting volcanic heat seep into bones that suddenly felt ancient, watching fire breathe in patterns he'd memorized across centuries. The net lay coiled beside him, waiting to be unmade, its materials reclaimed for future projects. Some things break, he thought again. Some weakness reveals itself despite perfect construction. The marriage was done. Aphrodite would move on, perhaps to Ares, perhaps elsewhere. The other gods would gossip briefly, then forget, their attention wandering to newer scandals and complications. And he would remain here, in forge light and familiar solitude, creating things that lasted longer than love apparently did. It wasn't the life he'd imagined during brief, hopeful weeks after the wedding. But it was honest, real. His. The forge fires crackled. Metal cooled in distant pools. Time moved forward as it always did, indifferent to divine heartbreak or mortal suffering alike. Hephaestus picked up his hammer eventually, feeling its weight settle into his palm like an old friend returning. There was work to do. There was always work, and in work, if nowhere else, he knew exactly who he was. The days following his return to Etna passed in quiet restoration, each one measured not by sunrise or sunset, but by the rhythm of his hammer, the hiss of heated metal meeting water, the familiar cadence of creation that had always brought him home to himself. Hephaestus worked without urgency, allowing his hands to remember what his heart was still processing. He crafted small things at first. A silver cup for wine, its surface engraved with waves that seemed to move in firelight. A bronze clasp shaped like ivy leaves, delicate despite the strength of the metal. Simple pieces that required focus without demanding perfection, the kind of work that soothed rather than challenged. The Cyclopes understood, as they always did. They moved around him with gentle consideration, their single eyes bright with concern that needed no words. They brought him cooled wine in the evenings, left fresh bread from the island's mortals near his resting stones, asked no questions about Olympus or gods or marriages dissolved before witnesses. Their kindness was practical, unobtrusive, the kind that came from beings who knew that sometimes the best comfort was simply presence and silence. On the fifth day, when volcanic heat had finally worked its way back into his bones and the exhaustion had lifted enough for deeper thought, Hephaestus turned his attention to the net. It lay coiled where he'd set it, still humming faintly with the divine mechanics he'd woven into every invisible thread. Beautiful work, really. The craftsmanship was flawless. Each chain responded to tension with perfect calibration, adjusting its grip to match resistance exactly. A masterwork of responsive engineering wasted on Payne's architecture. He lifted it carefully, feeling its weight despite its gossamer appearance. In proper light, if one knew how to look, the chains caught reflections like spider silk after rain. Magical bronze, unbreakable yet flexible. Techniques borrowed from the automaton's joint construction, principles of motion and countermeasure applied to capture rather than creation. Useful knowledge, certainly. Worth preserving. But he wouldn't preserve the net itself. That would be monument building, keeping hurt visible long after the wound had closed. Better to unmake it, reclaim the materials, let the bronze return to formless potential, waiting for worthier purpose. Hephaestus carried the net to his primary anvil, laying it across the scarred surface with something approaching reverence. Even failed work deserved respect during its dissolution. The unmaking took longer than the crafting had. He worked methodically, heating each section until the magical bindings loosened, separating thread from thread, reducing complexity back to simple components. The bronze sang as it released, a high, clear note that echoed through the forge like memory becoming dream, solid becoming vapor. The Cyclopes paused in their own labors to listen, recognizing ceremony when they heard it. By evening, the net was gone. Only bronze remained, pooled and waiting, ready to become something else entirely. Hephaestus stood over it, feeling something shift in his chest. Not relief exactly, not forgiveness either. Just space where tension had been, room for breath that hadn't existed before. 3 days later, Zeus sent a message. Not a summons this time, but a request. Would Hephaestus consider undertaking a commission? Something unusual, something that required his particular gifts. The message arrived via Hermes, who lingered at the forge's entrance with uncharacteristic awkwardness, clearly unsure whether Hephaestus would welcome divine business so soon after divine catastrophe. "Tell him yes," Hephaestus said simply. "Tell him I'm a craftsman. Commissions are what I do." Hermes nodded, relieved. He wants a woman made, not a goddess, but not quite mortal either. Something in between. Pandora, he's calling her already before she even exists. All gifted. Each Olympian will contribute something to her nature, but you're to build the foundation. Clay and water and divine breath. Life from your hands. Hephaestus felt cold despite the forge heat. A woman. For what purpose? Hermes hesitated, then shrugged with practiced casualness. Punishment, apparently. Prometheus stole fire, gave it to mortals without permission. Zeus wants consequences. This woman carries a jar, sealed tight, filled with things better left, unopened. She'll bring it to humanity as bride gift. Her curiosity will do the rest. So I'm to craft suffering's vessel. The words tasted like ash. You're to craft a woman, Hermes corrected gently. What she carries, what she does, those are Zeus's choices, not yours. You're just the maker, the artist. Can't blame the sculptor for what the statue does after it walks away. It was poor comfort, and they both knew it. But Hermes was trying, in his way, to separate creation from consequence, to let Hephaestus remain craftsman rather than conspirator. After a long moment, Hephaestus nodded. I'll need clay from Olympus itself, and water from every realm. Sea, river, rain, tears if you can manage them. She'll be between worlds. She should carry all worlds in her substance. Hermes brightened, sensing acceptance. I'll gather them personally. 3 days enough? 3 days. When Hermes left in a flurry of winged sandals and casual grace, Hephaestus stood alone in his forge, contemplating the commission that felt less like honor and more like test. Zeus wanted punishment made beautiful. Suffering crafted with divine hands. A trap wearing woman's face. But what if he made her real instead? Not just vessel, but being. Not just punishment, but person. Zeus controlled the jar's contents, the circumstances of delivery, the cruelty of the plan. But Hephaestus controlled her creation. He could give her grace, intelligence, curiosity that was gift rather than flaw. He could craft her with the same care he brought to Achilles' shield or Athena's aegis. He could make her worthy of existence regardless of what existence demanded from her. The decision settled in him like molten bronze finding its mold. He would do this. He would create Pandora, but he would create her completely, with tenderness and precision and respect. If she was meant to bring suffering, let her at least bring it as fully realized being rather than simple tool. Let her have dignity in whatever role the gods demanded she perform. When the materials arrived 3 days later, carried by Hermes in vessels of gold and silver, Hephaestus was ready. He cleared space in the forge's heart, built a special platform of marble and volcanic stone, prepared tools he rarely used. The Cyclopes watched from respectful distance as he poured clay into a basin, mixing it with water from all realms until the consistency felt right. Smooth, but not slick. Firm but not rigid, responsive to touch while holding form. He shaped her slowly, over many days, working in silence broken only by the forge's eternal breathing. First, the skeleton of divine bronze, delicate but unbreakable, hidden deep within clay that would become flesh. Then the form itself, emerging from formless material like dawn emerging from darkness. He gave her height, but not excessive stature. Strength, but not masculine proportion. Features that balanced all the loveliness he'd observed in nymphs and goddesses and mortal women who'd caught his attention through centuries of watching. Her face took longest. He wanted intelligence visible there, curiosity inherent in the space between her eyes, kindness built into the curve of her mouth. If she was to be humanity's punishment, let her at least be punishment that arrived with grace. Let mortals look at her and see beauty that deserved existence, even if that existence carried consequences. As he worked, something unexpected happened. He began speaking to her, his voice low and rhythmic, almost prayer-like, telling her things she couldn't yet hear, explanations she'd need once breath-filled lungs he was carefully shaping. "You'll carry weight you didn't choose," he murmured, smoothing clay along her collarbone. "You'll be blamed for releasing what you were designed to release. They'll call you humanity's curse. But you're not curse. You're just creation, same as anything else I've made. Same as me. Something brought into being by forces beyond your control, expected to fulfill purpose you never requested." When the Cyclopes finally departed for evening rest, Hephaestus continued alone, working by firelight that painted shadows across Pandora's still-forming face. He knew the other Olympians would add their gifts later. Athena would grant her wisdom and domestic skill. Aphrodite would bestow beauty and desire. Apollo would teach her music. Hermes would provide cunning speech and deceitful heart, Zeus's particular request. Each contribution would layer complexity onto the foundation Hephaestus built. But tonight, in these private hours, she was only his. Only clay and water and divine intention, shaped by hands that understood rejection and purpose in equal measure. He worked until dawn touched the mountain's peak, until exhaustion finally demanded rest. When he stepped back at last, she lay complete on her marble platform, perfect and still, waiting only for the breath that would transform clay into life. The morning after Pandora's body lay complete, Hephaestus did not return to her immediately. He left her resting on the marble platform, undisturbed, while he turned his attention to other work. The forge demanded constant tending, and there were smaller commissions waiting. A new sword for a hero whose name he'd already forgotten. Replacement fittings for one of Apollo's temple doors. The rhythm of ordinary labor felt necessary after days spent shaping something extraordinary. The Cyclopes moved around him with their usual quiet efficiency, stoking fires, sorting metals, occasionally glancing toward the still figure in the forge's heart. They asked no questions. They simply worked, and Hephaestus was grateful for their silence. By afternoon, Hermes arrived again, appearing at the forge entrance with his characteristic brightness barely dimmed by volcanic heat. "Zeus asks how the work progresses," he said, though his tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than divine impatience. Hephaestus gestured toward Pandora without pausing in his hammering. "She's formed, awaiting breath and blessing." Hermes approached slowly, studying the clay figure with something like reverence. "She's beautiful," he said quietly. "More than I expected. Zeus wanted punishment given form, but this—" He trailed off, circling the platform. "This is art." "It's both," Hephaestus replied, setting down his hammer. "Everything I make serves purpose. That doesn't prevent it from being crafted well. When will you animate her?" "When the Olympians arrive to give their gifts. She should wait to completion, not wait half-formed for others to finish what I began." Hephaestus wiped soot from his hands. "Tell Zeus she'll be ready when he gathers the gods." 3 days, perhaps 4. Hermes nodded, but hesitated before leaving. "You gave her kindness," he observed, "in her face." I can see it even now, before breath reaches her. Zeus won't notice, probably. But I do. It's generous, considering what she's meant to accomplish. She's meant to exist, Hephaestus corrected gently. What happens after existence begins isn't her fault. After Hermes departed, Hephaestus returned to Pandora's side. He checked her form with careful hands, searching for imperfections he might still correct. A slightly uneven collarbone, fingers that could be more graceful. But these tiny flaws made her real rather than ideal, human rather than purely divine. He left them untouched. That evening, he began crafting her adornments. A simple dress of woven gold that would drape like fabric but never tear. A crown of flowers made from precious metals and gems, each blossom detailed down to individual stamens. Earrings shaped like falling stars. Sandals with clasps that resembled morning glories opening to sunlight. The work calmed him. Jewelry had been his first craft in Thetis's grotto, learned before weapons or armor, before the weight of divine expectation. Creating beauty for its own sake still brought peace that grander commissions couldn't match. On the third morning, the Olympians began arriving. Athena came first, gray-eyed and solemn, carrying her gifts in an embroidered satchel. She studied Pandora with the careful assessment of one who understood craft. "You made her well," she said simply, and Hephaestus nodded his thanks. Aphrodite arrived in a drift of rose-scented air, examining Pandora with professional interest. "Pretty enough," she allowed. "I can work with this foundation, though she'll never rival divine beauty, obviously." Apollo brought his lyre, and sunlight seemed to follow him even into the forge's depths. Artemis came reluctantly, uncomfortable with schemes targeting mortals. Demeter brought grain for blessing. Hera arrived last, her expression unreadable as she regarded the woman formed by her rejected son. Zeus materialized with thunder's distant rumble, commanding attention without effort. He circled Pandora's platform, nodding approval. "Well done, Hephaestus. She'll serve perfectly." The gifts were given in ceremonial succession. Athena touched Pandora's forehead, granting wisdom, weaving skill, and understanding of household arts. Aphrodite brushed fingers across the clay lips, bestowing beauty that would make mortal hearts ache and stumble. Apollo sang a brief melody that sank into Pandora's still chest, giving her voice and musical grace. Demeter offered grain and growing things, connection to earth and harvest. Artemis gave reluctant blessing of wild creatures' recognition. Hera contributed queenly bearing and dignity of presence, her expression distant as she performed the required ritual. Then Zeus stepped forward, and the temperature in the forge seemed to drop despite surrounding flames. "I give you curiosity," he declared, his voice carrying weight that made even the Cyclopes straighten. "Relentless, consuming curiosity that will not rest until satisfied. And cunning speech, courtesy of Hermes here, that you might persuade and charm, and ultimately doom." Hermes touched Pandora's throat, whispering words in a language older than Olympus. When he stepped back, something shifted in the clay woman's face, some subtle rearrangement that suggested complexity beneath surface innocence. Finally, Zeus produced a jar. Not large, hardly bigger than amphora for wine, but sealed with wax and divine prohibition. Intricate warnings covered its surface in script that seemed to writhe and reform as Hephaestus watched. "This accompanies her," Zeus announced, "sealed until curiosity demands otherwise." Which it will, inevitably. Pandora cannot resist mystery any more than fire can resist burning. Hephaestus felt something cold settle in his chest. The woman he'd shaped with care was now vessel for calamity, weighted with gifts that would guarantee destruction. Yet she remained beautiful there on her marble platform, innocent of the role being written into her very substance. Zeus raised his hand, divine power gathering like storm clouds condensing. "Awake," he commanded, and lightning forked from his fingers into Pandora's chest. She gasped. Clay became flesh in an instant, transformation rippling outward from where Zeus's powers struck. Her eyes opened, deep brown and startlingly aware, fixing first on the god-king looming above her, then sliding past him to find Hephaestus standing in the shadows. Their gazes met for a single breath. In that moment, Hephaestus saw understanding flicker in her newly animated face. Recognition of what she was, what she carried, what awaited. Then Zeus spoke again, drawing her attention back, beginning the explanations and instructions that would send her toward the mortal world and waiting catastrophe. Hephaestus turned away, unable to watch. He returned to his anvil, taking up hammer and tongs, beginning work on something, anything, that would occupy hands and mind while the Olympians completed their scheme. The hammer's rhythm steadied him. Metal heated, shaped, cooled. These were certainties. These were truths he understood. When the gods finally departed, taking Pandora with them in a procession of divine light and self-satisfaction, the forge felt emptier than usual. The marble platform stood bare, still holding faint impression of the woman who'd rested there. Hephaestus approached slowly, running scarred fingers across the cool stone. He'd given her everything he could within the constraints imposed: grace, dignity, intelligence beneath beauty. The capacity for thought beyond her designed purpose. Whether any of it would matter, whether she'd find moments of genuine existence between creation and catastrophe, remained unknown. She was real, he said quietly to the empty forge. Whatever happens next, she was real. The Cyclopes returned to their work without comment, respecting their master's mood. The fires burned on, indifferent to divine schemes and mortal fates. And Hephaestus, god of forge and craft, picked up his hammer once more, finding what comfort he could in the eternal rhythm of creation that continued regardless of how creation's children were used. The days following Pandora's departure moved slowly in the forge's eternal heat. Hephaestus worked through each one with deliberate focus, accepting commissions as they arrived. A bronze shield for a mortal king whose name he didn't bother remembering. Temple hinges that would never rust or squeak. A ceremonial sword meant more for display than battle, its blade etched with prayers to gods who rarely listened. The work was ordinary. Necessary. The kind of craftsmanship that required skill but not passion, leaving his mind free to wander while his hands moved through familiar motions. He found himself thinking of Thetis often during these quiet hours, remembering the silver grotto where she'd first placed tools in his young hands. "Make what brings you peace," she'd told him. Everything else will follow. He wondered if she'd approve of what he made now. Gifts for gods who commanded. Weapons for wars he didn't fight. Clay women shaped to carry curses. The marble platform remained empty. He'd meant to clear it away, return it to storage among other unused materials. But each morning found it still there, and each evening found him walking past without touching it. Perhaps he wanted to remember. Perhaps he needed the reminder that some creations leave their makers changed. 3 weeks passed before the next Olympian commission arrived. Not through Hermes this time, but through Athena, who came down from the mountain as afternoon light filtered through volcanic vents in shafts of gold and shadow. She carried her helm under one arm, her spear catching light as she moved. The Cyclopes glanced up from their work, nodded recognition, then returned to their hammering. Athena had earned their respect through years of visiting the forge, not with demands, but with questions, learning rather than commanding. "Hephaestus," she greeted, her voice carrying easily over the fire's roar. "I have need of your craft." He set down the half-finished shield he'd been working on, turning to face his half-sister. She looked tired, he noticed. Even gods carried weariness sometimes, wearing it in the set of shoulders and the distant focus of eyes that had seen too much. "What requires making?" he asked. "Armor," she said simply, "for a hero named Achilles. Peleus' son, Thetis' child. The war at Troy calls for protection beyond mortal smithing." At Thetis's name, something shifted in Hephaestus's chest. The sea nymph who'd raised him, who taught him gentleness alongside strength, now had a son of her own. A mortal son, vulnerable and destined for the kind of glory that always demanded blood payment. "Tell me what's needed," he said. They spoke through the afternoon as shadows lengthened across the forge floor. Athena described the armor's requirements, the specific protections necessary against divine weapons and mortal fury alike. But she also spoke of Thetis, of her fear for her son, of how mothers love, regardless of fate's predetermined endings. "She asks specifically that you craft this," Athena added softly. No other smith would do. Hephaestus nodded slowly. Of course, Thetis would ask him. She'd never forgotten the broken infant she'd pulled from the sea, never treated him as less than whole. If her son needed protection, she'd turn to the one she'd protected first. "I'll begin tonight," he said. "It will be my finest work." Athena's expression softened into something approaching a smile. She reached out, briefly touching his shoulder. The gesture held no pity, only recognition between two who understood what it meant to be useful rather than beloved, valued for capability rather than charm. "Thank you, brother," she said, and then she was gone, ascending toward Olympus on currents of divine purpose that ordinary eyes couldn't track. Hephaestus turned to his stores of bronze and tin, gold and silver. The armor would need layers, each one serving specific function while contributing to the whole. Protection without restricting movement. Beauty without sacrificing strength. He began sorting metals, his mind already seeing the finished pieces before his hands had shaped the first. The Cyclopes gathered as he worked, understanding without words that this commission mattered differently than others. They brought materials as needed, stoked fires to precise temperatures, held pieces steady while their master welded and hammered and polished. The work took days, maybe weeks. Time felt fluid in the forge's heat, marked only by the progression of creation from concept to reality. He made the shield first, 5 layers of metals depicting scenes that told stories without words. Ocean waves surrounding the rim, cities at peace and cities at war. Farmers harvesting grain while dancers celebrated under starlight. The earth in its entirety, compressed and immortalized in bronze and gold. When finished, the shield caught light like a captured sun, radiant and terrible and true. The breastplate came next, fitted to protect heart and lungs while allowing the full range of motion that battle required. He chased its surface with patterns that suggested both serpent scales and feathers, something between earth and sky. The greaves for legs came after, molded to non-existent measurements, but somehow certain to fit perfectly when the time came. The helmet was last, created with special care. He shaped it to deflect blows while maintaining clear vision, adding a plume of horsehair that would stream behind its wearer like captured wind. As he worked on the final details, polishing each surface to mirror brightness, he thought of Thetis again. Thought of her hands steadying his when he'd first learned to shape metal, her patient voice explaining how heat and pressure transformed raw materials into something stronger. Her son would wear this armor into battle, would kill and die beneath its protection. The armor wouldn't save him from fate, nothing could, but it would give him the dignity of facing destiny properly equipped. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps that was all craft could ever truly offer. When the armor was complete, laid out on a clean workbench like the components of some divine puzzle, Hephaestus stood back and simply looked. It was beautiful. The firelight played across each piece, revealing depths and details that would shift with every viewing. This was craft at its highest form, function and art inseparable. Athena returned for it a week later, her expression shifting through surprise and satisfaction as she examined each piece.
"You'll be magnificent," she said quietly.
Terrible and magnificent, as heroes must be. "Tell Thetis," Hephaestus said, not looking at his half-sister, "that I remember everything she taught me." every lesson, every kindness. "She knows," Athena replied. Then she gathered the armor and was gone. The forge felt quiet after her departure, though the fires still roared and the Cyclopes still hammered. Hephaestus returned to ordinary work, to the endless commissions that arrived from gods and favored mortals. But something had shifted. Creating Achilles' armor had reminded him of why he'd first loved this craft. Not for power or recognition, but for the simple truth that making beautiful things was its own justification. Days blended into weeks, weeks into months. The forge's rhythm continued, eternal and unchanging. Hephaestus worked through heat and exhaustion, through solitude and the occasional divine visit. He crafted cups that never emptied, doors that opened only for chosen individuals, jewelry that granted minor blessings to those who wore it. Each piece carried purpose. Each creation mattered, at least to someone, and in the making, in the pure act of shaping raw materials into intentional forms, Hephaestus found something approaching peace. Not happiness exactly. That bright feeling remained elusive, but contentment. The deep satisfaction of purpose fulfilled, of using gifts that had cost everything to develop. If you journey through these stories often, wandering from forge to battlefield, from ocean depths to mountain peaks, perhaps let Olympus' dreams know such tales matter. A like, a subscription, small gestures that say these myths still speak across the ages. The hammer continues its rhythm in volcanic darkness, steady as heartbeat, eternal as story itself. And the smith god works on, as he always has and always will. The rhythm of the forge softens as evening deepens into night. Not the abrupt silence of cessation, but the gradual quieting that comes when even eternal work acknowledges the hour's weight. Hephaestus sets down his hammer with the careful precision that marks all his movements, placing it precisely where it will rest until morning. The anvil still radiates stored heat, glowing faintly in the dimness, like a coal banked for later rekindling. Around him, the Cyclopes begin their own rituals of rest. They bank their fires to embers, arrange tools in orderly rows, wipe soot from massive hands with cloths that will be ash-stained by dawn. They move with the synchronized grace of those who have performed these actions countless times, who know without speaking when the day's work has reached its natural conclusion. Even the golden automatons slow their movements, settling into stillness like dancers after music fades. The forge never truly goes dark. Volcanic vents continue breathing red-orange light across stone walls, casting gentle shadows that shift and sway without urgency. The heat remains, but loses its aggressive edge, becoming instead a blanket warmth that soothes rather than challenges. This is the forge at rest, the craftsman's sanctuary between one creation and the next, suspended in the peaceful nowhere of transition. Hephaestus walks slowly through his domain, checking each station with the thoroughness of long habit. He tests the security of metal stocks, ensures delicate works in progress are protected from dust and moisture, confirms that nothing remains vulnerable to overnight cooling. His uneven gait makes no sound on the worn stone floor. He has walked this path so many times that his feet know every depression, every slight rise, navigating without conscious thought. He pauses beside the marble platform where Pandora once stood, that empty space that has witnessed so many of his greatest and most troubling creations. Tonight it holds only shadow and possibility, waiting for the next commission, the next challenge, the next opportunity to transform raw material into meaning. The platform's emptiness doesn't sadden him anymore. It simply exists, patient as stone, ready when needed. In the far corner of the forge, where heat meets coolness and firelight surrenders to natural darkness, Hephaestus has arranged a resting place. Not a throne or couch, nothing that suggests royalty or luxury, but a simple arrangement of smooth stones warmed by proximity to volcanic heat. Furs gathered from creatures who shed them willingly cover the stones, creating softness without extravagance. A small bench holds water in a bronze cup of his own making, polished until it mirrors starlight. He settles onto the stones with a sigh that carries the day's accumulated weight. His twisted leg extends before him, no longer hidden or apologized for, simply part of his body's truth. The other leg folds naturally, finding the position that centuries have taught brings the most comfort. His powerful shoulders, shaped by endless hammering, relax against the stone wall behind him. For the first time since dawn, stillness claims him. The forge breathes around him. Gentle pops from cooling metal punctuate the deeper rumble of Earth's internal fires. Somewhere, water drips in steady rhythm, each drop marking time without demanding attention. The Cyclopes have withdrawn to their own quarters, leaving him this solitude he has learned to cherish. Even the automatons have dimmed their golden eyes, entering whatever rest state their divine construction allows. He thinks, as he often does in these quiet hours, of the long journey from that first terrible fall to this present moment. The infant cast from Olympus, spinning through clouds toward certain death. The silver grotto where Thetis's gentle hands had taught him that kindness existed. The first forge beneath the waves where he discovered that making things could transform pain into purpose. Each stage of the journey feels both impossibly distant and immediately present, past and present merged in memory's eternal forge. He remembers Hera's face when he returned to Olympus, riding that sea creature through the clouds. The complexity of emotions that had crossed her features, shame and pride and regret and relief, all tangled together like poorly sorted metals. They had never spoken of the casting out, never addressed that foundational wound directly. But his work had become its own conversation, each perfect creation, a statement that needed no words. She wore his jewelry. Zeus wielded his thunderbolts. Olympus itself rested on foundations he had strengthened. Some conversations happened through craft rather than speech. Aphrodite crosses his mind as well, though the pain of that betrayal has long since cooled to something manageable. He can think of her now without the sharp edge of fresh hurt, can even appreciate the strange gift that heartbreak had given him. It had driven him deeper into his work, forced him to find wholeness in creation rather than relationship. Perhaps she had taught him, accidentally, the most important lesson, that relying on his own gifts rather than others' affection brought more reliable peace. The shield of Achilles still occupies part of his awareness. That armor sailing toward Troy, toward glory and tragedy intertwined, Thetis's son wearing protection crafted from gratitude and remembered kindness. When the young hero fell, as prophecy promised he would, at least he would fall magnificently. At least Hephaestus had given him that much, the dignity of facing fate properly equipped. Some gifts matter most, not for what they prevent, but for what they allow. His eyes grow heavy, weighted by the comfortable exhaustion that follows honest work. The banked fires pulse gently, their light softening further as coals settle into deeper rest. The forge's heat wraps around him like the embrace he learned to provide for himself, self-sufficient warmth requiring no outside source. His breathing slows, matching the steady rhythm that has governed his days since time began its counting. Tomorrow will bring new commissions, new challenges, new opportunities to transform formless metals into intentional beauty. Gods will send requests. Mortals will whisper prayers. The Cyclopes will arrive at dawn, ready to begin again. The forge will wake with volcanic sunrise, and his hammer will lift once more. But that is tomorrow's concern. Tonight belongs to rest, to the peaceful emptiness between one creation and the next. If these stories of forge and fall, of craft transforming pain to purpose, have carried you toward sleep's threshold, perhaps return to Olympus dreams when next you need such gentle company. A like or subscription helps keep these ancient tales alive in modern darkness, myths whispered across time for those who need them most. The forge will remain, fires banked but never extinguished, ready to welcome you back whenever weariness calls for mythic rest. Sleep now, as even gods must sleep, watched over by banked fires and finished work, knowing that all worthy crafts require both labor and rest. The hammer will wake when morning demands it, but tonight let silence and ember glow be enough.